Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg.
And I'm Lyndsey.
And we have another great show for you today. But first, Lyndsey, do you have any media recommendations, shout-outs, or just any other happy thoughts to get the good vibes rolling here at the start of the episode?
Yeah, I feel like I always just have media recommendation because I love receiving media recommendations. So hopefully people like getting them as well. But you and I saw the movie Bottoms last week. I think it's getting a wider theatrical release and is available in more theaters now. But I wanted to recommend it because I loved it so much. It's like a teen sex comedy. It reminded me a lot of Mean Girls, which was like very formative for me in my teenage years. There's also kind of hints of like the John Hughes movies from the 80s. But it's set in a high school. It's these two gay girls who start a fight club to try to make out with cheerleaders. And it's just a perfect movie. Like, it's a tight 90 minutes, which I feel like you don't see very often anymore. Movies are so fucking long now. And it's very silly. And there are parts of it that are just like absurd without like explaining why the world is like a little bit absurd in strange ways that you're not expecting. But it's also grounded. And like, I feel like you could see a lot of your own kind of high school experience or how the high school experience is portrayed in this movie. I really loved it, and I think everyone should see it. I hope it becomes like a classic teen movie.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed it as well, and I also need to give a shout out to Marshawn Lynch,
who
yes, might be the greatest comedic actor of our times, and is just generally, I think, one of the funniest people ever.
Yeah, so he plays the teacher who's like the faculty advisor for the fight club that the girls start. And I heard that a bunch of his funniest lines were improvised. Like, he's killing it.
Absolutely.
His post NFL career, like, he's an acting boy now.
Yeah. It also, the plot of the movie, I think, was, or at least like parts of it were slightly like close to home for us in a bit of a weird, like, idiosyncratic way, which is that, so like the fight club ends up happening, but one of the concerns at the start is it might get disbanded because they don't have a faculty advisor, or like, what if the faculty advisor doesn't show up?
Yeah.
And that exact thing happened at our high school.
Yes.
Like, I try not to talk too much about like specific things or people in the past, because, you know, like I've made the choice to be a somewhat public person, but a lot of other people haven't. So like, I don't want to you know, share personal things that they might not want to be shared publicly. But this was on the news. It's already public. We had a self-defense club at our high school that lasted about one semester because the faculty advisor really just didn't show up. And so it just turned into an after-school fight club. And this was right at the time when cell phone cameras were starting to become ubiquitous. And there was, like, I'm not going to give these two people's names, but like, again, this was on the news. They're out there.
Yeah.
But like, one kid just beat the shit out of another kid. And it was recorded on a cell phone video, got posted on YouTube.
Yeah, early YouTube.
And folks were like, where is the faculty advisor? He was nowhere to be seen.
He did not show up.
He got let go. But yeah, so that was a weird part of my high school experience that I never expected to see portrayed on the big screen.
Yeah, really nice. The movie was a lot bloodier than I was expecting it to be. Like, it was violent.
Yes.
But I loved it. Do you have a media recommendation today, Greg?
I do. So we recently watched a 3-part docuseries on HBO called Telemarketers, which is like kind of an investigation of this, of a particular kind of scammy telemarketing industry. Like there's been a lot of media about like foreign telemarketing scams,
Right.
like a lot of the big like scammy Indian call
Yes.
centers, for instance.
Ooh, just quick recommendation in there. The Reply All long distance episodes. Back
Yes.
Classic Reply All.
Very good.
Amazing.
But yeah, so that aspect of scammy telemarketing has gotten a lot of shine. But this was about a different kind of telemarketer scam
Yeah.
that mostly is based in the US, and well, this particular one was based in New Jersey, and it mostly raises money for like kind of like public sector unions.
Mm-hmm.
So mostly police unions, but like some like firefighter unions, and some random like scammy charities related to like cancer relief funds and stuff like that. But yeah, so the person making it was a guy who just like didn't really have many life aspirations, dropped out of school young, and just a job at a local telemarketing center was the only career he could get. And yeah, he showed up, and at first he was just like, hey, this workplace seems crazy, but you know, I'm kind of a burnout, so like this is fun. I love it. But it is just crazy. Like the folks here are wild. So yeah, I'll just bring my camera in and just film some of the crazy stuff going on.
Yeah.
And then he makes a buddy there named Patrick J. Pespis, which the show is theoretically about telemarketing. It is actually about Patrick J. Pespis,
Yes.
who is maybe he's one of the most charismatic people I've ever seen portrayed on screen, and I love him. He's incredible. But yeah, he suggests to the documentarian that like, hey, this is more than just a wild, zany workplace. Like, I think a scam is going on here. So they start investigating it from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't give any further details to spoil anything about the documentary or what they find. But it was very entertaining. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. I really was impressed by how long the documentary spanned. Like, the early footage is from 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, I think so. Like 2002, 2003, something like that.
Yeah, and by the end, you're in 2020. So it's like a super long time. It's been this guy's like life's work so far, like documenting his workplace and then investigating and creating this documentary of like just this crazy thing that he experienced when he was a teenager. And it was really incredible. You could tell that so much like love and thought went into creating this, and it was really special.
Yeah, it was. We used to have like a big documentary phase. We haven't watched a documentary in a while, I don't think. But
we used to watch bad documentaries though.
Yeah, but a lot of them were very fun.
Yes.
Like the Gerson documentary, where it starts off kind of normal, and then the last 40 minutes are just like, here's how much coffee to shoot up your butt.
Yeah, it took a turn.
Yeah, very fun stuff. But anyway, this was like an actual very good, entertaining documentary.
Yes, HBO documentary. Yeah, good.
Yeah. All right, so you wanna get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so before we start the show, we have just two very quick housekeeping notes. The first is a bit of an announcement. So when the week where this episode is going to be released will be the 2-year anniversary of Macro Factor, our nutrition app. And so, yeah, it's been a very rewarding experience. Like it's helping a lot of people. And we appreciate everyone who's used it, who's checked it out. Yeah, everything related to it has just gone better than we ever could have anticipated, and we are deeply grateful. And when this episode is published, our 2-year annual report will also be published. We can link that in the show notes. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, if you're interested in just looking back at what we've been doing for the past year and what we have planned for this next year, that will be linked in the show notes if you want to check it out. Like, you know, if maybe you've used it previously and you left because it didn't have some key feature you were interested in, and you're like, hey, does it have this now? Stuff like that will be in the annual report. Or if you're a current user and you're like, hey, what do these folks have planned for the next year? It's a lot of it's going to be related to further expanding and improving the coaching functionality, which we're very excited about. But yeah, if you're interested in that at all, it will be linked in the show notes. Second thing, just as more of a general housekeeping note, is we're going to be shifting the next episode of the podcast after this one and the next research spotlight back by a week. So this episode will be coming out the 13th of September. On the prior schedule, the next episode would have been coming out the 27th. Instead, it will be coming out October 4th. The reason for that is basically just we have a lot going on. I'm going to be out of town for a week. And so instead of rushing to just get out lower quality content just for the sake of getting out content, we're just pushing everything by a week to ensure that the content is of the quality you've come to expect. I'm not going to say the highest quality that's ever existed.
But people have come to expect very long, very in-depth podcast episodes.
Yeah.
And that takes time.
I feel like we're not in a position to like objectively quantify the quality of the podcast.
Yeah, I have no idea.
You know, it is some level of quality and we don't want it to go below the normal level. So anyway, things are getting pushed by a week. Just so you know, when an episode doesn't hit your feed 2 weeks from now, it's not because we're taking another long season break or anything like that. Another episode will just be coming out the week after that.
Right.
All right. Plugs really quick and then get into the content.
Yeah, so if you're enjoying the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you want to purchase supplements from a reliable source and support the podcast at the same time, buy from bulksupplements.com and use the code SBSPOD to get a 5% discount. And like Greg mentioned, MacroFactor, 2-year anniversary this week. That's the main product that we focus on these days. It's a premium macro tracking and diet coaching app. We both use it and love it. And I think we're almost to 90,000 other people using it now, which is crazy and cool. You can try it for free for 14 days by using the code SBS during sign up. It's available on the App Store and Google Play. Or if you want to learn more, you can check out the website macrofactorapp.com.
Absolutely. And if you would like to stay up to date with all of the cutting edge research getting published to help you build more muscle, get stronger, etc., check out MASS. That stands for Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. So yeah, if you're a strength or physique athlete or coach, that is an excellent resource. If you would like to follow the show, get plugged into the communities, etc., join our Facebook group and or subreddit. The Facebook group is Stronger by Science Community. The subreddit is reddit.com/r/StrongerByScience. If you would like to get free study breakdowns sent to your inbox, typically every other week on podcast off weeks, though again, circling back to the show notes, one of the research spotlights is going to get pushed by a week as well, just to stick to that research spotlight podcast cadence. You can check that out and sign up at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. And finally, as another reason to join the groups, if you'd like to ask questions that we'll answer on the podcast, you can record a brief audio clip of those questions, keep it under 60 seconds, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. When we're recording an episode on a particular topic and soliciting questions about that particular topic, we will post about that in the Facebook group and subreddit. So if you want to ask just any general question, you can record that clip, send it to the email address. Or if you want to increase the probability that your questions will get answered when we're looking for questions on a particular topic, make sure to join the Facebook group and subreddit so you will know when those prompts come. And I think that's about it in terms of plugs. Let's get into the episode. So, just as a general note, I'm sure, I don't know what this episode is going to be called yet, but I'm sure as you're looking at this, you can see the title, and it will either directly state that this is part 2 of the micronutrient series we're working on, or the title will strongly imply that it's part 2 of the series. But just want to make it clear, we're picking back up where we left off after the last episode. So yeah, check out the first episode in this series if you haven't already. In this episode, what we'll be discussing is actual micronutrient targets. So last episode, we talked about just the general categories of micronutrients, what micronutrients are. Mm-hmm. But the way most people interact with micronutrients is via micronutrient targets, like RDAs specifically, and almost exclusively. And so, like, for instance, I assume most people don't know what the actual RDA is for, say, like calcium or vitamin A or whatever else just right off the top of their head. But nutrition labels tell you how much calcium or sodium or whatever there is in a product relative to the RDA, like as a percentage. So those nutrient targets, again, specifically RDAs, are really providing the single anchor point that people have for interpreting how much of each micronutrient they should consume. And so, yeah, like people generally want to make sure they're consuming enough micronutrients and they're not entering a state of undernutrition. But most folks also generally don't have a particularly nuanced understanding of micronutrient needs, unlike, say, calories or macronutrients. So yeah, that's what we want to discuss in this episode, kind of where those nutrient targets come from, what they mean, and how you can interpret them for yourself. So before we get into all of that, before we delve into that research and some more of those nuanced topics related to the actual micronutrient targets themselves, I think we should first discuss a little bit of the history of micronutrient targets and government recommendations related to micronutrient intake. And I believe you did quite a bit of reading and historical research on that, Lynn. So
yeah,
take it away.
I did. Yeah, not as much as aspartame, so don't be too scared. Yeah. So the first set of government-sponsored recommended dietary allowances, which is RDAs, was released in 1941. And I want to talk a little bit about what prompted that. So as American men were called for military service during World War II, a hefty 1/3 were found to be suffering from disabilities known to stem from poor nutrition, which is rough.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and surveys of family eating habits carried out by government agencies in the mid-30s found that undernourishment was widespread and serious. So in response to this, the president at the time, FDR, convened the National Nutrition Conference for Defense in 1941, which is just kind of a wild name for a conference.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's indicative of a lot of things, both good and bad, that that are just kind of hallmarks of modern life, which is like, I don't think that many people think that hard about just how many aspects of our modern world were like directly shaped by war and like wartime considerations.
Exactly.
So yeah, like the impetus for the first micronutrient recommendations was war related. Mm-hmm. Like you had data from the 1930s suggesting, lots of people are malnourished, but when does the government decide it's actually time to take action and do something about it?
Yeah.
When you want to make sure that the boys we're sending over to Europe are ready to fight.
Right. Yeah. So the result of that conference was the first set of government-sponsored RDAs, and it started with 6 vitamins and 2 minerals. So they were vitamins A, B1, B2, B3, C, and D, and calcium and iron. In a government report called Are We Well Fed? A report on the diets of families in the U.S., which was also published in 1941, the authors concluded that only 1/4 of families in the United States ate a diet that could be classified as good. And they defined good if it exceeded by 50% the minimum requirements set for those vitamins and minerals.
Mm-hmm. So that's a relatively low bar, but that many people still failed to clear it.
Exactly. Yeah. So as an immediate solution, the conference suggested food enrichment programs that were intended to restore foods to their pre-processed levels of nutrients. And food manufacturers had already started some enrichment, specifically adding B vitamins to flour in the late 30s, when those vitamins became available in bulk through industrial synthesis.
Yeah, and just as a little bit of context for that, a lot of those B vitamins are present in the germ of wheat.
Oh, yeah.
But like in general, white flour is it tastes better, it's easier to work with, blah blah blah, whatever. So yeah, like processing to remove the germ of the wheat did make a tastier product to eat, but did also remove a lot of those vitamins. So yeah, that is what is being added back in food fortification programs.
Right. Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of foods that maybe had more vitamins and minerals in their unprocessed form.
Correct,
but then
yeah.
once like industrialization started processing foods a lot more, it was stripping them of those vitamins and minerals. And so then this program was basically like, okay, let's go add those back in again.
Mm-hmm.
So they were adding the B vitamins to flour, but now everything really went into speed drive because everyone was really freaked out about the poor quality of most Americans' diets. The milling industry transitioned to enriched flour and bread products pretty much voluntarily before mandates were even handed down in 1943. And just as a quick aside about like people generally being freaked out, there also seemed to be a widespread PSA style warning campaign that was like freaking people out about vitamin deficiencies. Mm-hmm. So journalists, government agencies, and home economists focused on general dietary guidelines linking specific food groups to essential nutrients. Mm-hmm. So it's not like telling people like get this vitamin or whatever. It's just telling them like this is the food you should eat.
Which I will say for people who probably aren't planning on getting super deep into nutritional science, I think that's probably a good way to go about it.
Right.
Like if you tell someone like, hey, eat more vitamin K, then the next question they'll have is just like, hey, what foods are rich in vitamin K?
Exactly.
So if you're concerned that people are under consuming vitamin K, you can say, hey, try to eat some more of these foods that are rich in vitamin K. So that makes a lot of sense to me just from a messaging perspective.
Definitely. So yeah, it made sense for them to be recommending food groups, but how they started communicating the importance was by showing these really disturbing like before and after photos of vitamin deprived lab animals. Mm-hmm. So they would show a deformed, underweight, really sick looking vitamin deprived rat as an after. They also used like chicks, guinea pigs, and pigeons, and juxtaposed that against pictures of the well-fed, healthy before rats, like before they were deprived of vitamins, mm-hmm. which is scary.
Yeah.
And of course, the information was aimed at women who were primarily responsible for shopping, planning meals, and cooking for their families. So it's like really scaring people and like communicating like you better cook a nice meal for your family or else your kids are going to look like these sick rats
and it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, of course that's going to freak people out, but you know, there's always, I think, like a consideration of like how important messaging is and like how much you want to freak people out.
Yeah.
Because if something is like really crucial, like maybe that serves a productive purpose. But yeah, it sounds like regardless of the intention behind it, like that would probably cause quite a bit of concern.
I would think so. Yeah. So the 1940s also came with an expansion of the recommended food groups in an attempt to help people get those vitamins and minerals. The new standard was called the Basic 7. And I just wanted to talk about this really quickly because I just think this is a funny food group
Mm-hmm.
standard. So the 7 food groups: 1, green and yellow vegetables; 2, oranges, tomatoes, and grapefruit; 3, potatoes and other vegetables and fruit; 4, milk and milk products; 5, meat, poultry, fish, or eggs; 6, bread, flour, and cereals; and 7 is butter and fortified margarine.
Hell yeah.
Like an entire food group for butter.
That rocks.
And also just the classification of potatoes and other fruits and vegetables, like potatoes being so big that they get like their own call out there, and then they're just tacking on and other fruits and vegetables.
So I will say
Potatoes are very good.
they are relative to the time when this was being put out. So this was like what, early 1940s, right?
Right.
So this was kind of during or near the tail end of the Great Depression. And so in addition to like insufficient micronutrient consumption, there were also issues related to just total calorie intake. Because this was also relatively soon after the Dust Bowl as well, which is where a lot of crops were lost in the Midwest because of over farming.
Yeah.
And then like high winds and just kind of a perfect storm for crop failures. And so there were general food shortages, and potatoes rock just as a source of calories and general
sense.
nutrition. I believe potatoes, I think you can get about 4 times as many calories per acre of potatoes than you can from like any other staple crop, like wheat or corn or rice or whatever.
Right.
Like it is a hefty difference. So, and also if memory serves, I think potatoes deplete the soil less rapidly than other like staple crops do.
Probably so, yeah.
And so for the time period, recommending increased potato intake when you're in an era where a lot of farmland had just been lost due to depletion, and there was just like general widespread undernutrition. Like recommending people eat potatoes is pretty clutch. And I also think that there is, sorry for going off on this tangent about
this
potatoes.
is interesting. I love potatoes.
But so there used to be a stigma against potatoes. Like it was,
What?
yeah. So it was, I think a lot of it had to do with attitudes of like class perception. Because since potatoes were so cheap and plentiful, they were, they were in fact, and were also perceived to be kind of the food of the underclass. And so now I don't think they have that same kind of stink attached to them. Like,
Yeah.
everyone likes potatoes. They're delicious. But it used to be that a lot of folks would just kind of avoid potatoes because they're like, that's poor people food. Like that's not what you eat if you're doing better for yourself. So having a government recommend like, hey, no, like potatoes are good, and we're going to call them out as like basically their own food group, and yeah, like try to eat some potatoes. It probably helped at least a little bit with some of those perceptions, saying that like, hey, potatoes can be a food for everyone. You know,
It's a PR campaign for potatoes.
yeah. Of all of the things that could
Seems
get
like
a
it
PR
worked.
campaign, like I think potatoes deserve it.
Yeah.
Potatoes rock.
That's true. So unfortunately, these 7 food groups lasted for about 20 years. By the 1960s, though, the number of food groups had been reduced to 4 much more boring categories: milk, vegetables and fruit, meat, and breads and cereal. And just for comparison, I was interested to see like how this differed from what the core elements of a healthy diet are in the most recent guidelines. And right now it's 6 categories. So 1, vegetables of all types; 2, fruits, especially whole fruit; 3, grains, at least half of which are whole grain; 4, dairy; 5, protein foods, which includes lean meats, poultry, and eggs, but also includes like vegan protein like beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, and soy products. And 6 is oils, including vegetable oils and foods.
That makes sense.
So I want to go back to talking about the RDAs, and this is going to lead us into our discussion for today. So those first guidelines in the 40s only included the one reference value for the RDA.
Mm-hmm.
And because the allowances were meant to provide superior nutrition for military personnel, they included a pretty large margin of safety as well. So even though this guidance was a positive step forward, there were still a lot of questions about, consumption of vitamins and minerals, how much you actually need.
Mm-hmm.
There was little information about the lower or upper bounds. So you might know the RDA for something, but you don't know how far below or above the RDA you can go before it's actually dangerous. So that applies both on an individual level and on a population level for people hoping to conduct studies to determine rates of inadequacy and seeing if things were improving at all.
Mm-hmm.
The RDAs were revised every 5 to 10 years after the 40s, and in the early 50s, USDA nutritionists created guidelines for serving sizes for food groups. So knowing how many servings of a food you'd need to achieve your RDA was likely very helpful. It's kind of wild that wasn't included from the start. I'm glad that they got on that relatively quickly.
Well, yeah, and it's just a practical way to address that problem, because it's not it's not like everyone had a smartphone and mobile app that they could track their nutrition on down to the gram.
How would you know? You would have no idea.
Yeah, so if you want to eat enough, they're just hey, eat 3 cups of whatever, and
yes.
Okay, I can wrap my head around that and actually quantify it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's necessary. But it was still just the one number, still just the RDA for 50 years. I was really surprised by this. The first use of 3 dietary reference values wasn't until 1991 in the UK.
Damn.
So that is a full 50 years after we got RDAs for the first couple vitamins and minerals. So these included a lower level. The three reference values included a lower level at which deficiency would be considered to exist in almost all, an average requirement, and a higher level that would be adequate for almost all in the age and sex group to which it pertained.
Mm-hmm.
From there, the DRI framework, which is what we're going to talk about next, in the US was conceptualized in 94, introduced in 97, and tweaked over the next 10 years or so. In 2011, they revised the DRI values for calcium and vitamin D. Mm-hmm. In 2019, they revised for sodium and potassium. And just earlier this year, they released revised values for energy. But none of the other DRIs have been revised since first published between 97 and 2001.
I will note that is in the U.S. context. In Europe, the EFSA is much more consistently rolling out updates and stuff.
That's good. The the DRI is what U.S. and Canada use, from what I understand, and they're struggling. There are tons of issues related to funding and political will, methodology, and cooperation between the governments who are using this framework. But this stuff is really important, and there needs to be a plan for updating it. Obviously, it's important for formulating dietary guidance, but there are a lot of other critical health applications that depend on the DRIs in the US and Canada. So guiding the design of health programs used by the VA, federal hospitals, and nursing homes, many civilian health facilities as well. Mm-hmm. Guiding the design of healthier federal nutrition programs like school meals, WIC, and SNAP. DRIs are also used for dietary counseling in hospitals, long-term care facilities, and prisons, for ensuring nutrient needs are met for armed forces, which, was where this all started.
Yeah, callback.
Yeah, and providing a framework that is used by many other countries and international organizations when setting their own standards. Mm-hmm. And, all of these things are dependent on DRIs that are not being updated, and it seems like there's really no plan in place for them to be able to update them.
Yeah, I think I think in your initial kind of longer form notes on this section, you noted that like you said, there, as far as anyone can tell, there's not sort of wheels turning or gears in motion for improving this, which Just as a general note for listeners, I mentioned this in the last episode, but we have some written content on the Macro Factor website about micronutrients and all of that stuff. I'll link that again in the show notes. But in, I believe, the first article in our micronutrient series on the website, I linked to kind of like a post-mortem of the what would you call it? Like collegium or whatever, like the group of people that got together to put together the first DRIs. So they made a post-mortem, which was just kind of going through issues they ran into with the process of generating the DRIs, gaps in the literature, and ways that like the framework could be improved and recommendations could be improved in future iterations. And as far as I can tell, like they did all of this work to put together a post-mortem to do a better job next time.
Yeah,
and
lay a foundation.
And it's been like 20 years.
Oh,
and as far as we can tell, there's not a next time anywhere on the horizon, which is a bummer.
Yeah.
Though I should note, as mentioned a second ago, European health agencies are much more on top of this. The EFSA is doing a better job of like reevaluating the evidence on a rolling basis and putting out more updated reports. I don't think there is still like as much ongoing original research as there was in like the 70s, 80s, 90s, which was kind of like the heyday of like micronutrient specific research. But yeah, in terms of like rolling updates to the guidelines, we kind of kicked it off. Like we were the ones who made the DRI framework, which Europe was heavily inspired by with their DRV framework, but they are the ones who seem to be doing a much better job of carrying that torch.
Right. Well, and the UK was the first to introduce the 3 values as well.
Yeah. Which was influential in kind of generating the DRI framework to begin with.
Yep.
So with that out of the way, let's talk about the DRI framework.
Okay.
And all of the different micronutrient kind of targets and values that we'll be talking about this episode and what they mean, where they come from.
Yep.
So, there are a lot of acronyms we're going to talk about, and I apologize about that a little bit, but it's kind of unavoidable. Like if you're digging into research on this topic, you will come across these acronyms. It's just basic stuff you have to be aware of. Most people are really only aware of RDAs, and they're not even that aware of what RDAs actually mean or imply.
Right.
Just as a general note before I dive into this, there are 2 different sets of acronyms, and I will tell you both of them, but otherwise I'm going to stick to the American terms, just because like over half of our podcast listeners are from the US. But also the frameworks map one-to-one onto each other. So, when, for example, like when I say DRV or DRI, just think DRV. Or when I say RDA, just think PRI. It should make sense as I get into it.
Yeah, I think so.
So to start with, DRI. That stands for Dietary Reference Intake. And DRIs refer to just all of the scientifically derived reference values for various nutrients. In other words, DRI is the general term used to describe all of the other nutrient targets and kind of signposts that I'm about to discuss. The European version of DRI is DRV, which stands for Dietary Reference Value. Probably the anchor point for the DRI framework, which again is very rarely discussed, at least to the public, is the EAR, which stands for Estimated Average Requirement. The European version of that is AR, which just stands for Average Requirement. And EARs are pretty self-explanatory. Name is Estimated Average Requirement, and guess what it is? It is the estimated average requirement for each particular nutrient. And So for each nutrient, about half of individuals would need to consume a little bit more than the EAR for kind of optimal health and to make sure they're meeting their nutrient needs. And about half of individuals can probably get away with consuming a little bit less than the EAR, assuming that the intake needs for each nutrient are normally distributed, which most of the time they are. And for what it's worth, I suspect a lot of people think that RDAs are communicating the information that EARs are actually communicating.
Yep.
In other words, I think people broadly view RDAs as like the average requirement of nutrients. But as I am literally just about to talk to, they are not.
Yeah.
The actual average requirement is the EAR. So what is the RDA? Like, that's the big one that most people are aware of. Or in a European context, the PRI, which stands for Population Reference Intake. RDA stands for Recommended Dietary Allowance. And so, yeah, like just about everyone will at least have a passing familiarity with RDAs or at least be aware of that term. As mentioned before, standard food labels present micronutrients in reference to their RDAs. And rather than being the average requirement for a nutrient, you can think of the RDA as kind of a better safe than sorry micronutrient target. Right. They're designed to meet the needs of 97 to 98% of the population. In statistical terms, you estimate the needs of like the average needs of a particular nutrient for the general population. You calculate the variability of those needs. Like, some people will need more, some people will need less. Right. Calculate that standard deviation. And then the RDA is just 2 standard deviations above the mean. Right. Which should cover, again, like 97.5%.
It's that margin of safety that I talked about because it was developed for military personnel.
Correct. Yeah. All of which is to say, it's a good number to shoot for. Like if most people are meeting the RDA for a particular nutrient, like there's only like a 2-ish% chance that they might need to consume a little bit more versus, there will be a very low chance that they'll wind up with like insufficient nutrient status. But it is also the case that most people can probably get away with consuming less than the RDA, kind of like by definition, right? Because it's a number that's 2 standard deviations above the mean, and still be broadly okay. The inverse of the RDA or PRI, and this is one where Americans and Europeans agree on an acronym. Nice. Is the LTI or lower threshold intake. And so LTIs are basically the inverse of RDAs. RDAs are 2 standard deviations above the mean. LTIs are 2 standard deviations below the mean. And so, like about 95% of individuals will have intake requirements for each nutrient somewhere between the LTI and the RDA, with the EAR kind of being the average midpoint there. Okay. And so LTIs you can think of as kind of like the bare minimum you should aim to consume. Like there will be a pretty good chance that you will do better if you consume more than the LTI, and also a very good chance that if you're consuming less than the LTI for a particular nutrient, you will probably wind up with overall insufficient intake and probably feel a little better if you consume a bit more. So that is kind of like the core of the DRI framework. You have the EAR as the average, RDA 2 standard deviations above the mean, LTI 2 standard deviations below. Yeah. So you have like a range there. Correct. Which is really helpful instead of trying to shoot for an RDA, which is probably more than you need already and might be discouraging to shoot for. Yeah. But then that begs the question of, what do you do with nutrients where you don't actually have inoough research to determine the average needs, or certainly don't have enough research to calculate the inter-individual variability in terms of needs for that nutrient? Yeah. And for that, you have the AI, which, again, this is a shared acronym between the US and Europe. That stands for adequate intake. And AIs are kind of similar to RDAs or PRIs, or sometimes EARs or ARs, kind of depending on, as I'm about to talk about, they're kind of a mess sometimes and don't always communicate the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But they're supposed to function like kind of similarly to RDAs most of the time, but they are kind of a bit less scientifically rigorous. So essentially, to calculate in EAR and then by extension in RDA or an LTI, you need a certain amount and quality of evidence to actually be able to calculate and quantify those things. So if a nutrient only has an AI, what that means is that they are confident that it is an essential nutrient and you need to consume some amount of it for good health.
Right.
But the research is insufficient to actually like understand and describe the spectrum of needs for that nutrient. So AIs sometimes communicate slightly different things. The way that they're typically set is researchers will study the dietary patterns of people who are apparently healthy and who aren't experiencing the negative effects that you would experience if you were consuming in an inadequate amount of that nutrient. And then you just look at the average intake of that nutrient in that population and you say, well, it appears to be adequate. That is the adequate intake. Like that might sound too simplistic, but that is how most AIs are set.
Right.
But there are sometimes other ways that they could be set. So sometimes ARs are set based on the lowest observed intake at which no signs of insufficiency are observed in a population. So it would be kind of like a similar setup to what I was talking about before. You take an apparently healthy population, you look at the intake of that nutrient in the population, but instead of looking at the average intake in that apparently healthy population, you kind of look at like how low the lowest intake is in that apparently healthy population and say, well, these people are consuming this amount. They seem to be fine. So that is probably an adequate amount. And sometimes it's defined in reference to some other external standard. So that is the case, for instance, for calcium intake targets for infants. That is an AI instead of like a EAR, RDA, LTI type of deal.
Okay.
In part just because like there's kind of a moral imperative of like, if you think that a baby is malnourished, like instead of taking a second to observe them and and try to understand, it's just like, no, like
it's important to just nourish
them. Give them calcium.
Right.
Like this is critical. We need to get on this pretty quick. It's like the AI for calcium intake for babies is defined in reference to the calcium intake they would receive if they were exclusively fed breast milk. So like that's how much calcium is put in infant formula is determined.
Makes sense.
It's like, well,
they're like nature figured it out, so we'll just do that.
Yeah. Like breastfed babies seem to be fine. Like we assume they're getting enough calcium. We certainly hope so. So that seems to be an adequate amount. So yeah, that's how the AI is defined there. So yeah, in other words, like the exact like information that is like implied and communicated by an AI differs from nutrient to some extent. But the functional takeaway is the same. You have an AI because there's not enough research to define an EAR and RDA. But if you consume the AI, like there's a very good chance that you will be consuming enough of that particular nutrient, which is why I said like functionally you can think of them as pretty similar to the RDA because that's broadly what RDAs are communicating as well. And then the final acronym to talk about is the UL, which is also a shared acronym between both the American and European frameworks. And UL stands for Tolerable Upper Intake Level. And so not every nutrient has a UL. For some nutrients, there are no known drawbacks of consuming a lot of that particular nutrient. So, for instance, a lot of the B vitamins fall into this category. It's like, I don't want to throw out any specific one because
Right.
I don't want to fuck it up. Like I know that there's a UL for vitamin B6, for instance, as I discussed in the last episode, but like I think that like thiamine, for instance, I think if you just consume a lot of it, your body just excretes the excess. So kind of like, who
so
cares?
it's like we don't need this.
Yeah. And I hope that's the case for vitamin B12. I assume it is because like some people like megadose the shit out of vitamin B12 and seem broadly fine. So yeah, like not every vitamin or mineral has a UL, but a lot do. And essentially what it is communicating is the amount that you can consume on an ongoing basis and have very low risk of negative effects related to overconsumption. And there's a bit of a margin of safety built into the UL as well, depending on the severity of the consequence of consuming too much.
That makes sense.
And also a margin of safety built in based on like the quality of the research supporting the UL.
Okay.
So yeah, just for instance, like vitamin C, if you consume too much vitamin C, you just kind of get an ouchy tummy. Like maybe you get some nausea, maybe you get a little diarrhea, but like it's water soluble. Like you'll poop for a day or two and then broadly be fine. Like it's not going to cause any lasting damage. But excess vitamin A intake can be lethal. Like you consume too much and you die. Or if you don't consume enough to die, it could cause like pretty severe liver damage. And so yeah, the degree of safety is determined in part by kind of the severity of those consequences.
Right.
And like I said, also the level of evidence supporting them. So there are two other just broad concepts to be aware of here. One is the no adverse effect level for a particular nutrient, which is often determined by like case studies where like what is the largest amount of a nutrient that we see people regularly consuming and just never having issues with it. Or if you don't have like a rigorously quantified no adverse effect level, you might have a lowest observed adverse effect level, which is like almost always kind of defined by case studies or sometimes animal research, which is then extrapolated. And so that's essentially just like what is the least amount of a nutrient that we see someone at some point consuming and having an adverse event that we are very confident we can trace back to overconsumption of the nutrient versus something else. And yeah, so like the amount of evidence like supporting a no adverse effect level or a lowest observed adverse effect level, and also like where that evidence is coming from. Is it based on a larger population study? Is it coming from just like a handful of little case studies? Or is it extrapolated from animal research? All of those things will determine how much of a margin of safety is built into the UL. So like, for instance, with vitamin C, I think the UL is kind of right below the lowest adverse effect level, where it's like, if you, and I think it's, if memory serves, it's 2,000 milligrams, maybe 1,000 milligrams, whatever. Don't take that to the bank. But yeah, it's somewhere around there. And it's just like, yeah, if you consume a little more than that, like if you do have the absolute temerity to overconsume vitamin C, we don't need to build in that much of a margin of safety because like you're not going to
be fine.
Yeah, you're not going to be that negatively affected by it. Versus something like vitamin A, where the consequence of overconsumption can be very, very serious. There's a much larger margin of safety built in where like the UL for vitamin A is 3,000 micrograms per day, which is like really high for most diets, but is also like kind of low if you consume a decent amount of liver. So like a single serving of like raw beef liver, which I assume you'll cook first, but like a 100-gram serving of raw beef liver.
Depends.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, you probably should.
There's a whole king. There's a whole king about eating raw liver.
I guess so. But yeah, like 100 grams of raw beef liver contains like 5,000 micrograms of vitamin A, which is notably above the UL. But the UL is communicating like the amount that you could consume for an extended period of time,
Right.
even if you're at a high risk of like deleterious effects of overconsumption, while like very, very likely being safe.
Yes.
And so, for instance, like most people could probably have like a serving of liver a day and be fine because there's a large margin of safety built into that UL.
Yeah. They don't want people bumping up against that top
Right.
number. Yeah.
And like I said, there is like a chronic consumption aspect of this. So like if you wanted to kill yourself by consuming like an acute toxic dose of vitamin A, that generally requires like close to 100,000 micrograms, like somewhere between like 70 and 100,000 micrograms,
Yeah.
which is way higher than the 3,000 microgram UL. And chronic toxicity also is generally observed when people are eating around 10 times the RDA per day. So like 7,000 to 9,000 micrograms per day. It's like the UL for vitamin A is like around 1/3 of the amount that people typically are consuming if they have chronic toxicity, and like 1/30th of the amount that people would typically need to consume for acute toxicity. But since, you know, like vitamin A toxicity has such severe consequences, they do build in a pretty large margin of safety there. So yeah, like ULs do communicate slightly different things for different nutrients,
Yeah.
but by and large, it's saying like, hey, if you consume less than this per day, even if you're at high risk of negative effects of overconsumption, there's a very, very good chance you'll be fine.
Right.
But by extension, if you like slightly consume, like go over the UL for a particular nutrient one day, you don't need to call poison control. Like you'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, just treat it as kind of a soft limit where if you absolutely blow the fuck past it, maybe you need to be a little concerned. If you just kind of exceed it a little bit from time to time, like it's probably okay, but try not to do that. Like that is broadly how I would interpret a UL. So yeah, let's see. So kind of like circling back, just to kind of recap this discussion of all of these acronyms. Nutrition labels, what they report, and like exclusively what they report, is nutrient content of a food relative to the RDA. And RDAs are the values that are drilled into our heads. And that does make sense from a public health perspective.
Yeah.
Like it might lead to some unnecessary degree of concern because, like, by definition, most people don't need to consume all the way up to the RDA. And so it might make some people like a little bit neurotic, where it's like, oh no, like I'm a little under my RDAs. Like, is that going to cause nutrient deficiencies
Right.
or whatever? But it's also the case that like most people don't need to know this entire framework. But I think that the way that these DRIs are often communicated does lend itself to an unnuanced understanding of this stuff, where a lot of people might think that like, oh, if I am below the RDAs, I am therefore deficient in that nutrient, which is like very, very often not the case. Or conversely, like if I go over the RDA, like, oh no, I'm over consuming it, like that's also bad, which also is typically not the case. Like there for most nutrients, there is like a very large gap between the RDA and the UL. So yeah, like I just wanted to communicate all of that stuff. Like this may feel a little bit overkill to go through what all of these DRIs mean, but I think it is useful just to understand typically how little is communicated to us about
Definitely.
micronutrient needs, and two, like just so you'll have a stronger like mental framework for understanding the span of nutrient needs, kind of both on an individual and population level, and how to think about each one of those DRIs.
Okay, Greg, now that you've discussed what the DRIs are communicating, will you talk a little bit about the process for determining these targets?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was writing the website content for MacroFactor about this stuff, this was something that I dug into for the first time, and I personally found it quite interesting, so
Nice.
hopefully you will as well. So yeah, there is generally a 3-step process to determine kind of like the DRI framework and targets for a particular nutrient. And the first step is determining the appropriate analytical endpoint to analyze in the first place. So that could be a different analytical endpoint for different nutrients. So it could be, for instance, the balance of a nutrient within your body. So the example I'm about to provide, I'm going to talk about calcium. And so like the DRIs for calcium are based on calcium balance studies. So
Okay.
how much calcium is excreted relative to consumption at different levels of calcium intake. Like that is one way that it might be determined. Another way might be blood biomarkers. So for instance, if you know that a particular circulating level of a particular nutrient in your blood is what is either causative of or like associated with the health outcome you're interested in, you might look at those blood biomarkers, either of nutrients or just like something else that is influenced by the nutrient. Or it might just be symptomology. So you look at how much of a particular nutrient people need to consume to not exhibit the symptoms that result from underconsumption of that nutrient. Those are kind of most of the broad categories of analytical endpoints that folks would look at to kind of start determining EARs, RDAs, LTIs. But yeah, that's the first step, just determine that analytical endpoint. The second step is to analyze the data. So the folks who come up with these targets, by and large, are kind of doing a systematic review and or meta-analysis of research that has already been published. Usually they are not going and doing original research for themselves to determine this stuff. So yeah, like typically this is going to start with a meta-analysis of studies that are directly relevant to the selected analytical endpoint. So it might be the results of multiple depletion-repletion studies, which I believe I mentioned in the last episode, and I'll talk about a little bit more later. Or it might be the results of multiple nutrient balance studies, for instance. And I'll use calcium as an example here. So the RDAs and LTIs and EARs for calcium are determined by calcium balance studies. Instead of kind of like looking at like population levels of calcium intake relative to, say, osteoporosis risk, which could be confounded by any number of things, or just kind of give you a bad snapshot. Like if you look at people's calcium consumption, say every 5 years, and then osteoporosis risk late in life, like who knows how their intake changed over time, or who knows if like the survey data was like actually representative of their intake at the time. Like there's a lot of kind of analytical challenges there. Whereas ultimately what you're interested in with calcium for the most part is just calcium balance. Like how much calcium are people actually retaining? That gives you a really good indication of, you know, are they preserving bone? Are they gaining bone? Are they losing bone? And that's mostly what you're interested in with calcium. So yeah, the way calcium balance studies work is they just analyze calcium intake versus excretion. Monitoring intake is simple enough. You just monitor the food and beverages people consume, you know, the calcium content of those foods and beverages, bada bing, bada boom, you know, intake. Monitoring excretion is also straightforward, although it's a little bit gross. So you consume calcium, your body absorbs a lot of it, doesn't absorb all of it.
Yep.
And some of it passes through your digestive tract and you poop it out. And then once it's absorbed, maybe some of it isn't directly utilized in bone formation, or maybe some bone breakdown, just bone turnover is taking place. You have excess calcium that needs to be excreted. You do that in your urine. So you monitor food intake, you collect poop, you collect urine, you look how much calcium is going in, and you look at how much calcium is going out.
Yep.
And from that, you can determine, are people in net positive calcium balance or net negative calcium balance? And so, yeah, for determining the EAR, and by extension, RDA and LTI for calcium, you look at all of the studies that have analyzed calcium balance, and then you're essentially just kind of looking for the point at which calcium balance is on average neutral, and that would be your EAR. And then you calculate the variability of calcium needs in order to attain neutral calcium balance. And so 2 standard deviations above that, you would put the RDA. 2 standard deviations below that, or below the EAR, you would put the LTI. And that's about it. Like that is that first step to kind of build in that margin of safety. And I will just note that for a lot of nutrients, maybe most nutrients, the results can vary quite a bit study to study. Like oftentimes the data is somewhat murky, and you might be able to find like an individual study with like hundreds of individuals that would support a much lower RDA, or again, like large, well-powered studies that would support like a much higher RDA. And it's not always clear why you're seeing different results in those studies. So like it is sometimes a little bit murky, and I'll link this in the show notes as well. I used this calcium illustration in one of the website articles as well. And there is like a graph that's kind of like the output of this meta-analysis on calcium balance studies, which was then used to determine like in this case, the like PRI and AR, because like this was a EFSA publication.
Yep.
But like you can see for yourself the data that those targets are based on, and like just check it out for yourself, and like imagine that like the trend lines and like error lines weren't present, and
it just looks like it's all over the place.
Well, yeah, like check it out and try to determine for yourself, like if you would be like extremely confident at what those figures should be. And I suspect that will not be the case.
Yeah. Ugh, that seems so stressful trying to determine a value or a set of values based on that.
Yeah. I mean, like, I will say, I think based on what EARs ARs and PRIs and whatever are supposed to communicate, I think they did like absolutely the best job they could with the data that existed. But it's just like the data that exists, like sometimes you look at a data set and like what it is telling you is just fucking crystal clear.
Right.
Oftentimes with these nutrient targets, it's not. Like it is a little bit murky.
Yeah. And I guess that makes sense, but like we talked about last episode, when you see those exact figures, you're like, oh, it must have been extremely obvious, like why they set these figures as it is, or as they are. Like the data must be extremely clear on this.
Yeah.
And nope.
No, I would not say that it is. And calcium is an example of a nutrient that there is like quite a bit of research on.
Oh yeah, so
because it was one of the OGs that like FDR was worried about. There has been a lot. Osteoporosis has been a public health concern for a long time. There is a lot of research on calcium.
Right.
So yeah, it's there are like kind of some judgment calls to make with calcium.
Yeah.
There are even more judgment calls to make with nutrients that just have less research on them.
That makes sense.
So yeah, that's step 2. You kind of collect and analyze the data that's been published. And then step 3, you kind of have like final adjustments and rounding. So like, for instance, with calcium balance studies, there is like a little adjustment that needs to be made to kind of the results of that meta-analysis because those calcium balance studies monitor intake, but they only monitor excretion from urine and feces.
Yeah.
But you also lose a little bit of calcium in your sweat, which...
Ugh, so complicated.
Yeah, and also, like, researchers aren't going to collect every drop of sweat from 100 individuals for a few weeks.
Dude.
Well, yeah, I mean, like,
They can, but they're not
like
going to.
You can do it for like a couple hours, but like you can't do that for days or weeks at a time. And if you did, it might give you unrepresentative data, because like those suits will probably make you sweat more. So it might give you like an unrealistic understanding of how much calcium is lost in sweat.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So anyways, like that is just like data that is unaccounted for in the studies that are used to determine this stuff. But we do know that in general, folks lose about 40 milligrams of calcium per day in their sweat. So they just kind of like looked at the data and they said, hey, we're just going to bump all of these numbers up by 40 because folks are losing about 40 more milligrams of calcium than what these studies are actually accounting for. And then, like I said, it's final adjustments and rounding. So it's rounding because humans like nice round numbers.
Yeah.
And once you add all of the adjustments, like the AR for calcium would have been 745 milligrams per day. The RDA would have been 944. People don't like that. So it's just like, hey, PRI, it's 950. AR, 750. So yeah, that's kind of the final process, just to wind up with numbers that humans like rather than numbers that aren't functionally different that people won't like.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I think that, and I also think that like calcium does provide a pretty good illustration of how large the range of individual nutrient needs can be.
Okay. So
like in the US, for instance, I think the RDA for calcium's like 1,000 milligrams per day. The PRI for calcium, like in Europe, is 950 milligrams per day. And that is the number that is communicated to people. But the AR was 750, which is a little bit lower. And the LTI was like 550. So the total range from like the LTI to the RDA is like a 400 milligram per day range. And the PRI is like not quite 2x the LTI, but like it's relatively close. Like there is a big difference between 550 and 950.
Yeah.
And like when you look at the individual data that went into supporting that range, like there were folks who were in positive calcium balance consuming like 500-600 milligrams of calcium per day. And there were also a handful of people who were in negative calcium balance consuming like 1,000-1,100 milligrams per day. So like there is a pretty big range there. And I think people do find that a little bit surprising. Like does that surprise you at all? Or like did it surprise you when you encountered this for the first time?
Yeah, definitely. I wonder, I mean, is it something that you're aware of as an individual? Like, is it usually linked to some sort of illness or something that you would be aware of if you went to a doctor or got blood work done or something? Or is it just kind of like, yeah, some people just have different needs and we're not really sure why?
Oh man, it would depend.
Yeah.
Like person to person, nutrient to nutrient.
Right.
Because yeah, like the impacts of like, well, you know, I think the impacts of like insufficient consumption, like not deficient, but like a little bit less than would be optimal. I think that they're like rarely obvious and like probably wouldn't show up without blood work most of the time. And like in the case of calcium, like if you're not getting like a full blood panel done or like getting a DEXA scan every year to look and see how like bone mineral density is changing, you probably like you might never find out.
Yeah.
So
it's not like you're experiencing some sort of symptom that would make you think like, I think I need more calcium.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
And the thing is like there are a lot of people who can probably consume a little bit less of a nutrient than what their body theoretically needs for like their entire life and generally be fine. So this is this is something that I was planning on talking a little bit more about in episode 3.
Okay.
Which is that like there is like a pretty stark difference between like insufficient intake and deficient intake of a particular nutrient. And like deficiencies are almost impossible to not notice because like they cause severe problems. And so like in the case of like if you have deficient calcium intake, that causes like pretty significant feelings of lethargy, like pretty extreme like muscular fatigue and weakness. Man, like I said, I was planning on talking about this next episode, so I don't have everything in my notes. Yeah, we can talk about it next
episode. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Like I'll do a decent enough job here.
Okay.
And it can also just cause like heart attacks, like heart failure. Because like calcium is important for like regulating heart rhythm. So yeah, like if it kind of comes on gradually, it may not be like immediately obvious that like, hey, I'm experiencing these things because I'm not consuming enough calcium, or like I suddenly stopped consuming enough calcium. But there will be things that are like significantly wrong that would suggest to you like, hey, I should probably get this checked out. And that is typically the case for like deficient nutrient intake. Insufficient nutrient intake is usually like you probably wouldn't even notice, and often the deleterious effects aren't even like guaranteed to happen to you in the first place. And so like, for instance, I just talked about what would happen if you had like truly deficient calcium intake. Kind of the worst impact of insufficient calcium intake, a little bit less than your body needs, like kind of chronically putting you in negative calcium balance, is you have an elevated, like you'll wind up with an elevated risk of osteoporosis, which is like, it's not something you want, you know, like, but that's also not something you're going to realize until you get like quite a bit older. Like it's not going to show up until like considerably down the line, unless again, like you're monitoring your bone mineral density every year and seeing like consistent decreases even in your 20s or 30s or whatnot. And also like the extent to which it increases your risk is fairly modest. Like insufficient calcium intake, I believe, is associated with like a 10% increase in osteoporosis risk, which like isn't nothing. And like, I think more people than folks realize do get osteoporosis at some point in their lifetime. So it's not something where it's like, oh, it's a 10% risk going up from like 3% to 3.3%. Like it is like in real terms, a pretty large increase in risk as well. But you know, it is something where like, until that happens, you probably wouldn't have any like external, like obvious signs that you're not consuming quite enough. And again, it is like a 10% increase in risk. It's not like a guarantee. Right. It's like there will be a fair amount of people who like may have wound up with really high bone mineral density, and then they, for the rest of their life, are in like slightly insufficient calcium consumption range and just never have a problem.
They're just fine.
From it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. It is surprising. It makes sense, like you said, when you think about it, because you know, individual needs are present for a lot of different things. But I feel like with food, and even more with vitamins and minerals, it does feel like we kind of think of our bodies as machines. And it's like everybody needs the same amount. You just put that in and then you're fine.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Just got to change the oil.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's different for everybody.
And I do think that is kind of intuitive once you kind of like sit down and think about it for a little bit more. Because like, you know, the like nutrient labels might label total calorie needs in reference to a 2,000 calorie standard. But once people start getting a little bit interested in nutrition, they realize like, oh wait, no, like energy needs differ between individuals. If like you're small, sedentary, like maybe you only need to consume 1,500 calories a day. If you're like large and like super highly active, like maybe it's 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. Like there's an acknowledgement that there are pretty big ranges there. And so like, I don't want to get too far out over my skis. I just want to state on the front end that like, I kind of assume that this is the case, but I'm not like positive that it is. in terms of calcium needs, like, I kind of assume that it probably just relates to like how large your bones are. You know, like if you're a big person with a big frame and a lot of like a shitload of calcium in your bones, like I assume you probably need to eat more calcium to maintain a positive calcium balance. And I'll also note, like, as I mentioned before, like the research on some of this stuff is like kind of murky. Like there is an acknowledgement that needs for these nutrients differ between individuals, but there's a little bit less research on why that is the case. And I suspect a lot of it probably does just generally have to do with body size. You know, I kind of think that like smaller people who just they have less stuff, and like there's less stuff in them, you know,
less stuff in the meat sack.
Or I mean, like, for a more kind of like concrete example, a lot of the B vitamins are like coenzymes related to steps in the process of energy metabolism.
Yeah.
And like if you're just doing less energy metabolism because you're burning less energy per day, I kind of assume that might be a factor contributing to your B vitamin needs being like below the EAR instead of above.
Right.
But yeah, there's just less research on that. And I kind of think if there was more and better research, you could probably have kind of like more granular and appropriate individual recommendations instead of just kind of like pointing everyone at the same kind of broad range.
Yeah. And a range is even like more information than a lot of people get. Like we've talked about, most people really only think of it in terms of an RDA.
Yeah.
So thinking of it in terms of a range, even if it's like a population level range, is still like a step up and still helps you understand it a little bit better than just thinking about it in terms of this one value.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So kind of the key points here are that I think that like micronutrient recommendations are quite a bit less precise than I think a lot of people realize. For a couple of reasons. Like the data is rarely super cut and dry. Again, like I'll refer you to the graph of kind of like how the calcium targets were determined. And I'm not trying to say that like this is all bullshit and people are doing a bad job. It's just that like there is just more individual variability and more just general murkiness in the data that exists than I suspect people assume. Yeah. Also, there are sometimes even disagreements about what analytical endpoints to focus on in the first place. So like I mentioned, with calcium, they ended up going with calcium balance studies, but like a credible case could be made for like research, like more so focusing on research looking at calcium intake over a lifespan and like its relationship with osteoporosis risk.
Okay.
Like they decided against that for several reasons, but like a credible case could be made that like maybe that is an endpoint you could look at instead.
And that's step one of the process is determining that analytical endpoint. So then everything that flows down from there is based on this one thing that could have been different. Yeah. And what result would we have gotten if we had looked at a different endpoint? Yeah.
And also, like, I am absolutely not implying they looked at the wrong analytical endpoint there. Like, based on what I know, I suspect calcium balance studies were the way to go. And also, like, I'm not an expert on that. So, like, I assume they made a better choice than I would. But, like,
I think it's just important to say, like, there are judgment calls here.
There are judgment calls that have to be made. And there are people who are experts who don't always agree about the judgment calls that are made. Next thing is that there are like potential drawbacks just regarding the general types of research that are used to generate DRIs. So as I mentioned, sometimes they're based on like blood biomarkers, but it is not always exclusively the nutrient you're consuming itself that would influence blood biomarkers for that nutrient. So an example here is vitamin D. Blood vitamin D levels are certainly influenced by vitamin D intake, but they're also influenced by like how much time you spend outside, what latitude you live at, and the melanin content of your skin, like how much just skin vitamin D you're synthesizing. And then like other nutritional factors can influence balance of particular nutrients. So like with calcium, they're looking at calcium balance studies, but vitamin D intake or like vitamin D levels influence calcium absorption, and vitamin K levels or vitamin K intake influence calcium deposition into bones, which influences calcium balance. So like a lot of times the research is looking at a single variable, like calcium intake versus calcium excretion, when there are other nutritional factors, even just like other micronutrients that could be influencing that, which, you know, then makes it like, just like adds noise to kind of that single variable analysis of calcium intake versus excretion. And the last thing is that for the nutrients where the analytical endpoint selected is based on like acute findings, it's not always completely obvious that acute findings would necessarily and inherently generalize to long-term outcomes. So this has been like a criticism and just like criticism / like discussion topic for decades like amongst the people who do this type of research. It's like a lot of the micronutrient like DRIs are based on depletion repletion studies. And so like I said, I said I would talk about that a little bit more. And the way that they tend to work is like sometimes with humans, sometimes with lab animals, you just like feed them a controlled diet that has none of a particular nutrient for a while, and like bad things start cropping up, and then you just kind of like titrate the dose back up, or you might have like multiple groups where it's just like, hey, this group we're going to give you like a quarter of what we think you need, this group we're going to give you half, this group we're going to give you 3/4, whatever. So like it starts with the depletion stage, and then with the repletion, what you're looking at is kind of the average amount of intake you need during that repletion stage to ameliorate the problems that were caused by the depletion.
Yes.
And then the LTI is kind of like, hey, where do we start seeing improvements being made? RDA is kind of like, at what point is everyone fine? And we've like fully rectified the issue. And so like those are relatively acute studies. Like they take place over a period of weeks or months, but you know, you're eating food over a period of years, like your whole life. And so it's not necessarily inherently obvious that the way your body would respond to acute complete depletion, like zero consumption of a nutrient and then it being reintroduced, there's no guarantee that your body would respond to that the exact same way as it would to just consuming a little bit less or a little bit more of a nutrient kind of forever.
Right.
Because like there might be kind of compensatory mechanisms that would kick in if like you consumed, say, a little bit less vitamin A all the time. Like I don't like. I'm not saying that is the case. I don't know what those compensatory mechanisms would be, but it very well could be the case that like, hey, if you consume like maybe a little bit less vitamin A than what we think you should for months or years, like there are just physiological changes that take place to like accommodate that and let you be fine and not experience issues with like slightly lower intake, but not like complete deficiency. Versus like in a depletion repletion study, who knows? Like it might take weeks or months or years for those adaptations to happen. That wouldn't happen if you're just going through like a 2 to 4 week period of just consuming zero vitamin A. So yeah, like the like translating depletion repletion studies to the DRI framework is kind of like it is tacitly predicated on the assumption that those results would generalize. But I think it's still an open question, like the extent to which they actually do generalize. So just like purely on like a research design basis, there are still some open questions. And also, as mentioned before, like all of these considerations are just for the nutrients where we would consider there to be a lot of good data to like determine EARs, RDAs, LTIs in the first place. As mentioned, like plenty of nutrients just have AIs, which inherently means that the research informing those nutrient targets is less plentiful or lower quality. And as mentioned in the previous episode, the US and Europe don't always even agree about which nutrients have enough data to kind of support the DRI or DRV framework versus just issuing AIs. So for instance, like in the US, there are like RDAs and so by extension EARs as well for vitamin E and magnesium. In Europe, the EFSA looked at the same body of research and said, no, there's not enough for that. Like we're just going to issue AIs here, which kind of like goes back to discussion of like judgment calls. Like there isn't just judgment calls about analytical endpoints. There's also judgment calls about like the level and quality of evidence that exists to determine which one of these frameworks we're pushing it into. Are we going the DRI route or are we going the AI route? And another just like well-recognized issue with this framework is that it covers up and conceals a lot of messiness regarding like nutrient sources and bioavailability in the broader context of an individual's diet, because they are like inherently and necessarily only looking at like the intake of a single nutrient as like a single variable. But like you don't always like absorb and utilize the same amount of a nutrient that you might consume from different sources. So like a classic example here is like heme bound versus non-heme iron. So like your body has like hemoglobin, myoglobin, proteins with like little iron in them. And most of the iron you consume from animal products is heme iron. You know, now that I think about it, that might be a misnomer. Maybe it should be myo iron because it's mostly coming from myoglobin, not hemoglobin, but whatever, who cares? But yeah, so like the oral bioavailability of that is higher than most sources of non-heme iron.
Yeah.
Like iron from plant sources that is either just like mineral iron or just like incorporated into other proteins. Like your body does just generally absorb and utilize heme-bound iron a little bit better. And that's also the case for like if you've looked into like mineral supplements, like differences in oral bioavailability are probably something you're well aware of. Like the classic example is like mineral supplements that are oxides versus chelates. Like there's a huge difference in oral bioavailability. So if you just like go to Walmart and look at the cheapest calcium supplement you can buy, you'll see that it's probably calcium oxide, I would assume. And the oral bioavailability of calcium oxide is like below 10%.
Oh my gosh.
I think it's like 2%. Like it's basically a placebo pill.
Jeez.
But like
so people could be taking that thinking they're getting a certain amount of calcium and just like, nope, sorry.
Yeah. And I'll let's see. Lyndsey, could you just make a note real quick for me to Google this, or just like search PubMed when we get done recording? Because I do want to verify, like make sure I'm not like, because I know that oral bioavailability for oxides is really low, but I want to make sure I'm not like totally underselling it. And if I'm lying to you right now, there will be a note in the show notes.
Okay.
Hey, just making a really quick correction here in post. So with calcium in particular, generally you won't see calcium oxide in supplements. Calcium carbonate is the more common version that you will see. And in general, it seems like chelated forms of calcium do maybe have slightly better oral bioavailability than calcium carbonate does, but it is not nearly as big of a difference. What I specifically had in mind was stuff that I had read about magnesium supplementation in particular. Magnesium oxide does have horrible oral bioavailability. We're talking like 4 or 5%. And that is generally true of minerals where you will find oxide forms in supplements, but that does not apply to calcium. Like I said, generally you'll see calcium carbonate, which again might not be quite as good as chelated forms, but is still pretty good and does still have pretty decent oral bioavailability. Sorry for that error, and now back to the podcast. But like oral bioavailability for oxides is in general considerably lower than like chelated versions of the same mineral,
Right.
which is just like the mineral bound to some other biomolecule, oftentimes an amino acid. So if you see like calcium or magnesium, like citrate or aspartate or whatever, like a word ending in eight. That's a chelated or like it doesn't, like glycinate is coming up more often these days in supplement formulations. Doesn't matter. Like there are like little differences in oral bioavailability between different like chelates of various minerals, but usually it's just still like way better than oxides. And the differences between like different chelated forms usually isn't big enough to worry about for the most part. But yeah, like if memory serves, I think the oral bioavailability for calcium oxide is like 4%, and for calcium citrate is like 45% or something. Like it's a big difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, like none of that is communicated in DRIs. Like if all of the calcium you consumed was from calcium oxide, who knows? Maybe the RDA for calcium would need to be like 30 grams a day or some shit like that.
Yeah.
But from dairy products, the oral bioavailability is way higher. And so like that is inherently not communicated. And also like just other things in the foods you consume, as mentioned before, might positively influence absorption of a nutrient. So like vitamin D helping with calcium absorption, but they can also sometimes negatively influence absorption of a nutrient. So I think there's been maybe a bit too much like scaremongering about like so-called anti-nutrients, like oxalates and phytates. And like I said, I think people make them sound scarier than they actually are. But like the fact that they do interfere with mineral absorption like is uncontroversially true. And in particular, calcium, iron, magnesium, and zinc. So like you could potentially argue that like foods with oxalates and phytates are fine. Like you can eat them. But like if you eat a diet that is rich in foods that are high in oxalates and phytates, like maybe you should try to consume a little bit more of some of those minerals than people who ate a diet lower in those things. And like oftentimes that goes hand in hand. Like a lot of plants that are relatively rich in oxalates are also relatively mineral rich. So like it is a little bit easier oftentimes to consume a little bit higher levels of minerals if you are also eating like an oxalate or phytate rich diet. But all of which is to say, once again, like that's not communicated in the DRI framework.
Yeah. How could it be?
Yeah, absolutely not. And so yeah, like basically all of this stuff is like kind of messy, and I think messier than I realized before I started digging into it. And there's a lot of stuff that is not communicated in the single number of the RDA that most people are aware of and pay attention to almost exclusively. And so, yeah, like as we talked about with the last episode, when things are communicated in a single precise number, I think that gives the impression that the scientific consensus is also like simple and precise. Like that is why it is justified to just give the single like precise recommendation. But that's not the case here.
Yeah, not at all.
However, here's kind of the rug pull for this segment. That's kind of by design, and I think it's a good thing.
Okay.
So it is a negative in terms of if people see it and get overconfident and read into an RDA like way more like nuance and precision and whatever than it actually has, and like they know the RDAs for vitamins and minerals and assume that means they know a lot about those things, which relative to the general population, you do. Like most people probably don't have those RDAs like memorized. But like relative to how much there is to know about all of this stuff, like you don't know anything if that is all you're aware of, and think that it is like a super like precise single number that applies equally to everyone. But for most people, most of the time, I actually think it's good. And that is because DRIs are supposed to primarily serve the purpose of being public health tools. And especially as it regards to like communicating with the public, as mentioned before, like most people, there's no reason they would need to know almost anything that I've talked about in this episode. Like it wouldn't serve them hardly any purpose, except for like maybe a little peace of mind, like not like freaking out if they're like a little bit below or a little bit above the RDA. But like, I don't think most people do freak themselves out about that. So like, yeah, most of the time, like people just don't need to know more information than that. And typically, like, I mean, I know this firsthand as someone who has made a career in the long form content business. Like most people don't want long form content. Like if it's not something that's like directly like important and relevant to their lives, why spend 2 hours like doing a deep dive on a topic that just a 5-minute little PSA gives you enough for kind of moving through the world and in your day-to-day life.
Dagger through the heart.
Yeah, and so if like all of the nuance and context for every nutrient target was communicated for every nutrient target for everyone all the time, the net result wouldn't be that people would end up knowing more about micronutrients. They would end up knowing less because they would look at it and say, I don't fucking care.
Yes.
And I'm not going to dig into this.
They'd be like, that is way too much. Not doing this.
And so what an RDA does by design is give you a single number where if everyone hit that number, like around 98% of people would not be not only not deficient in any nutrient, but not even have insufficient intake of any nutrient. And that's a pretty powerful thing to be able to communicate in a single number. And when you're trying to communicate micronutrient intake needs to a population, in excess of 90% of which just don't care that much.
Right.
If you can get that one thing through their head of like, hey, if you reach this number, you're good. Like that's great for most people most of the time. So yeah, all of which is to say, I think that for this podcast, like if you're listening to this, you are way more interested in and way more invested in this stuff than most people are, and you like knowing more, you like doing deep dives and understanding like context and nuance and all of that. And so what we want to do with this series is be able to provide that for you, because like rounding up and like understanding all of this stuff for myself was even more time consuming than the total runtime length of this podcast series will be.
If you can imagine something longer than this podcast.
Yeah. And I would at least like to think that this is a communication medium that is more pleasant and accessible than just like asking you to dive into like all of the EFSA reports for yourself.
100%.
But it's also like way overkill for almost everyone, almost all of the time. And, but yeah, if you're interested enough in this topic to be listening to this podcast, it is, I think, the amount that you should know about this topic just to actually have like an actually good understanding of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So don't let the messiness stress you out.
Correct.
It was starting to stress me out, so I'm glad that you said that.
Yeah, like one of my goals in life is just to make people less overconfident about things in general, because I think people are just very overconfident about shit that they have no need to be.
Yeah.
And so yeah, my general approach to most things is I want to knock that overconfidence down a peg and then communicate to people that yeah, like this is more complicated than you thought it was, but most things are fine.
Yeah.
You know? Oftentimes it's the net outcome is like you need to stress about this thing less, not more. Because if like the baseline assumption of like this is like super well supported and like crazy precise, if that was true, then like a high level of stress and anxiety about not meeting nutrient RDAs would be extremely warranted. But since it is like kind of a little messier, kind of a little loosey-goosey, like a lot of people can go like a little bit below these. Most of the time you can go considerably above, and like nothing too bad's gonna happen either way. Like it communicates uncertainty, but also hopefully a sense of calmness and peace of mind.
Right.
I hope.
I think so.
Maybe not. Who knows? I think people who have like a high psychological need for closure, and like just needing to.
I don't think those people are here.
Oh, absolutely not. Like I
don't know where they are, but they're not here.
I assume I've weeded them out over the years, but anyway, this might not be good content for them, but that's fine. That's not our target audience.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. Kind of the big picture thing that we want to get across here is that nutrient guidelines are predicated on like cost benefit analyses. So it makes more sense, again, like if you want to get into this deeper instead of just looking at RDAs, it makes more sense to think about micronutrient intake guidelines as ranges instead of exact targets. So instead of interpreting just the RDA as like the thing that everyone needs to hit all the time, no matter what, or, you know, trying to be like sneaky and say like, ooh, well, not sneaky, but clever and say like, ooh, that's actually 2 standard deviations above. Actually, the one number to pay attention to is the EAR. Like that's the actual average requirement. Let's just focus on that one number. Instead of doing any of that, I think it just does make more sense to think about it as ranges.
Yes.
Where you probably don't want to be below the LTI. Like there's a very good chance that you will have insufficient intake if you're below it, or if you're someone whose actual needs are closer to the RDA, being below the LTI might actually cause like a deficiency, not just an insufficiency. So like, yeah, you probably do want to be above the LTI, and some degree of concern might be warranted if your consumption of a particular nutrient is regularly below the LTI. Things in the LTI to RDA range are generally like pretty okay. Where like if you're a little below the EAR, without like extra medical opinions or like blood work to like confirm stuff. Like if you're a little below the EAR, like between the LTI and EAR, it probably wouldn't hurt to consume a little bit more, but like your risk of nutrient deficiency is very low.
Yeah.
And as mentioned before, like it's not great to be insufficient in like have insufficient intake of particular nutrients, but like usually the actual kind of real world consequences of that aren't particularly serious. So yeah, like if you're between the LTI and EAR, probably wouldn't hurt to try to eat a little bit more, but you also, I think, probably generally don't need to be that stressed about it. If your intake is between the EAR and RDA, like you're doing good. Like there's a very good chance you're consuming sufficient amounts, or if you do just have like really high intake needs for a particular nutrient, you'll only be like very slightly insufficient in that range. So like everyone's going to wind up with like pretty decent outcomes there. And then between the RDA and the UL is just good. Like you don't need to be worried that you're exceeding the RDA for something and worrying that that's going to cause issues related to excessive intake if you're below the UL, because ULs are calibrated to be safe and conservative. But also like you probably shouldn't expect like additional great things to happen if you're exceeding the RDA like on purpose and getting closer to the UL. Like everything within that range will probably have pretty similar outcomes, like just good, but you know, it's not going to do anything like crazy or special, and also not going to be dangerous.
Yep.
And then above the UL, it's kind of a matter of like degree and risk tolerance. If you exceed ULs a little bit sometimes, like you're probably fine. if you're regularly exceeding them by a lot frequently for prolonged periods of time, might cause problems. And yeah, like I think that's just a good kind of like range-based framework to think about this stuff. All right. So I believe that is about it for the DRI framework and nutrient targets themselves. And the last little thing I have for this episode is talking a little bit about micronutrient tracking and like micronutrient contents of foods.
Okay.
And so yeah, let's get into it. So if you want to track your micronutrient intake, one of the things you should be aware of is that estimates of micronutrient intake that you would generate from logging your food and trying to track your nutrient intake that way are probably quite a bit more imprecise than you realize. And so like, I think like imprecision of nutrient intake tracking is something a lot of people are aware of if they spend a lot of time in like nutrition world or diet world. Like the little factoid that like calorie counts or like macronutrient counts of foods by law can be up to 20% off, like above or below. I think that's something that there is general broad awareness of. And so I don't think anyone is going into it assuming that their tracking is like uber precise, like down to 0.1% or whatever. But I assume a lot of people don't recognize that like micronutrient tracking is considerably more imprecise than macronutrient tracking. And that errors can not only be larger in an absolute sense, but can also be like kind of persistent for weeks or months at a time. So with macronutrients, oftentimes, I wrote an article about this for Stronger by Science back in the day that will be linked in the show notes. But the little factoid that is true, that calorie counts and micronutrient counts on food labels can be off by up to 20%. Like ultimately, like that doesn't end up mattering too much because like underestimates, overestimates, like they'll tend to balance out.
Right.
And also like if you like especially with like energy intake, if say you eat a diet where just everything you eat is kind of under, like the total calorie content is like underestimated by 10% on food labels, like it's kind of self-correcting because the net result will just be that you think your energy needs are like 10% lower than they actually are. And so, yeah, like you're actually eating and expending more energy than you believe you are, but any sort of adjustments you make have that tracking error built in.
Right.
So it kind of cancels out. Like it doesn't end up mattering typically. But with micronutrients, things are a little bit hairier. So you do have like some degree of like safety related to like calorie and macronutrient labeling error, because like the 20% range is like feasible to enforce by regulation. Whereas for micronutrients, generally people are just reporting either like the results of like food fortification, like, hey, we put like 10 milligrams of iron per serving back into this, in which case like those are probably very precise and accurate numbers. Or in the case of like whole foods, it's just kind of like based on like averages that are reported to research databases, and there's no like force to like enforce that, because like, you know, if you have apples in a fruit cup and those apples just have like lower levels of carotenoids than most apples do, and so like you slightly overestimate the vitamin A content of the apples in the fruit cups, like no one's gonna come after you for that, because ultimately it's not your fucking job to like do a full biochemical analysis of all of the apples coming into your factory that go into that food cup. And so you're totally safe and allowed to just assume that the carotenoid content of those apples are the same as every other apple, you know? But like the content of vitamins and minerals can differ considerably between like different fruits and vegetables to an extent that I think folks are somewhat unaware of. So for instance, and I'll link this in the show notes, there was a 2018 study testing the vitamin C content of various foods, but like one of the foods they looked at was baby spinach. And they looked at the vitamin C content at different points throughout the year. And they found that per 60-gram serving of baby spinach, the level of vitamin C was between 5.6 and 39.6 milligrams of vitamin C per serving, which, what is that? That's a 7-fold range from the bottom to the top. So that's quite a bit more than 20% above or below kind of the median value. And also, unlike calorie or micronutrient content, where like underestimates, overestimates within the context of a whole diet will generally like average out and wash out. If you're getting a lot of vitamin C from eating baby spinach, you would be alternately overestimating and underestimating your vitamin C content or your vitamin C intake for extended periods of time, because it wasn't just like a random stochastic large range. It varied by season. So during the winter, the vitamin C content averaged like 26 milligrams per 60-gram serving. And during the summer, it averaged like 10 milligrams per 60-gram serving. So there was more than a 2-fold range, not in terms of like highest and lowest values, but just like average content during the summer versus average content during the winter. So yeah, like you could very easily wind up with like relatively large over or underestimates for like weeks or months at a time, due to that seasonality component. And like I will also like readily admit that I cherry picked that. Like most micronutrients don't have
it's an extreme example,
as much variability or as much like seasonality. Yeah, like I chose an extreme example to make a point, and I'm admitting that to you. Don't get mad at me for cherry picking, because I admitted the cherry picking.
Spinach
picking, yeah. But like I said, just generally trying to make that point that things aren't necessarily going to wash out as much, and the total amount of variability can be quite a bit larger. And like it's also going to depend a little bit on like geography and farming practice, and just like what is the dominant like cultivar of whatever food is like being planted in a particular place in particular time. So like, and it also doesn't have to be like things differing a ton if you're like half a world away or in countries with like drastically different regulations related to like soil fortification or like irrigation or fertilizer or whatever. So I'll also link this in the show notes. There was a study looking at like reported nutrient content for like various different fruits and vegetables in Germany and the Netherlands, which are like right next to each other. And I assume they probably have like pretty similar regulations related to farming. And they found that in general, like a lot of foods had like higher vitamin A and vitamin C levels in Germany than the Netherlands. And like, you know, there could be like slight differences in regulations, or it could just be a matter of like the like kind of baseline levels of minerals in the soil, like influenced by the characteristics of the underlying bedrock, which you're not going to have like a good, easy, robust way to account for that. Which kind of like as supporting information for this, like why the micronutrient contents of various foods can vary so much, is like it makes sense when you think about it. And I think most people just don't think about it and kind of assume that plants are basically inert. It's just like a biological container for these nutrients that's like kind of the same every time. Like they grow, we pick it, we eat it, and like bada bing, bada boom, it is what it is. Or if you're like, you know, if you go like maybe a step deeper, you might think that it's influenced by like soil depletion a little bit, but yeah, like as long as you're using good farming practices, whatever, like it should basically all be the same all the time. But that's not necessarily the case. And like I think once I talk about this, I think you'll find the variability quite a bit more intuitive.
Okay.
So like with vitamins, plants make vitamins. We eat the plants, we get the vitamins. Those vitamins serve purposes for us. They also serve purposes for the plants.
Makes sense.
And they don't always serve the same purposes for plants that they do for us. And the needs of the plants to produce vitamins depends on what purpose they serve and how whatever processes they're supporting like vary over time. So I'll use vitamin C as an example here. Vitamin C for us, as mentioned in the last episode, is a essential nutrient because it's an important cofactor in collagen synthesis. Like pretty easy, simple enough. Plants, I should have looked this up before hopping on the mic. I don't think plants produce collagen. I know they don't have like tendons, but I'm pretty sure they don't produce collagen, or if they do, like they certainly aren't producing much of it. Like that's not the primary thing vitamin C is doing in plants, and I don't think it's doing it at all. Anyway, it primarily serves different purposes in plants, and vitamin C does a lot of shit in plants. So it has roles in iron uptake, photosynthesis, hormone production. So like plants produce hormones as well, pathogen resistance, all stages of the cell cycle, and quite a bit more. I looked up a review for this and forgot to link it in the show notes or in the outline. I'll find it again to link it in the show notes. But yeah, like vitamin C does a lot of stuff in plants that is not the same stuff it does for us. And like the needs of like the vitamin C needs of plants are going to likely be influenced like by where they are in their growth cycle and like what season they're in. So for instance, like going back to spinach having more vitamin C in the winter than the summer, like I don't know this to be the case, but just like one possibility is like vitamin C is important for photosynthesis. Spinach is receiving less direct sunlight in the winter than the summer, so like maybe it just needs to make a little bit more vitamin C in the winter to like help the process of photosynthesis along. So but yeah, like all of these things, like, you know, maybe there's more pathogens like in the winter than the summer, so it needs higher vitamin C production to like help with pathogen resistance. But yeah, essentially like it is serving an important purpose for the plant, and the plant's needs for it aren't going to be exactly the same all the time. So like the production isn't going to be the same all the time. So like the amount can vary over time. And in the case of minerals, so that's with vitamins, like they serve purposes in plants, and the needs of the plants for those vitamins can vary over time.
Yeah, the plants need vitamins too.
Yes.
They can use them.
For minerals, it is like mostly dependent on soil conditions. Like most of the minerals that wind up in plants get there because there's minerals in the soil. They're taken up in the roots and then transported elsewhere in the plant. And so the mineral content of plants is going to be heavily influenced by soil conditions. So I mentioned like soil depletion before, like that's something that there's been, I think, like a bit of a moral panic about. And I think people are also like slightly too freaked out about, where it's like, like there's less like magnesium in peppers than there was when our grandfathers were our age or whatever. Like that actually is true to some extent. But the extent of the decrease doesn't therefore imply that like the fruits and vegetables we consume are like unnutritious. Like they are like maybe a little bit less micronutrient dense than they used to be. Largely again due to soil depletion. Like there's a lot of people eating a lot of food, and like once magnesium from the soil is taken up into a plant and shipped off to market and consumed, like that particular magnesium molecule is not in the soil anymore. So if it's not repleted over time, like with like mineral enhanced fertilizers or whatever, or just like in some farming practices, there are just like mineral supplements that you would like put in the soil to like replete it.
Just imagine burying little pills. Here are your vitamins.
I mean, I think it's powdered
Yeah.
or like dissolved in water.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, so that is also like, that's going to influence the mineral content of foods. And so, yeah, like, a food grown in like a more mineral rich soil will just have like typically higher mineral content than the same food grown in more mineral poor soil. And it could be a pretty significant difference between those two pieces of produce, which again, just like an average number from like a standard research database isn't necessarily going to capture that.
Yep.
Just as a general aside, the wildest example of this that I came across was probably selenium. And so like the same general process applies with other minerals, but like selenium seems to be one of the minerals with like the most extreme differences between like selenium rich and selenium poor soils. Yeah, so like overall selenium intake basically seems to be like a crapshoot where like it's so heavily influenced by soil conditions and it can vary so much, which like that relates just to like bedrock stuff. Like there's just more selenium rich and selenium poor bedrock, and that kind of percolates up into the soil.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like there are foods that are like generally selenium rich or like have selenium, but like if it's grown in like super selenium poor soil, like you might still wind up consuming almost none. And so like that's been observed in parts of the US and parts of Europe. Those regional differences are observed. It's also been observed in China, and like China seems to be the area of the world with like the most extreme differences from like the most selenium rich to selenium poor regions. So there are two diseases linked to selenium deficiency that are, I believe, only observed in like different like selenium poor parts of China that like haven't been observed outside of that. Because like in the grand scheme of things, like true selenium deficiency is like quite rare. But like it has been noted in China. So there's a disease called Keshan disease, Keshan, which is like a particular type of cardiomyopathy that has only been observed in like these almost completely selenium deficient regions of China.
I've never heard of that before.
Another one called Kashin-Beck disease, which is also, again, like a very particular type of osteoarthritis that is only observed in those like completely selenium deficient regions. And then also there were issues in China in the 80s with like selenium toxicity in this one region, which was like the result of coal runoff that was apparently like very selenium rich that got into the soil. And like the people generally seemed to be fine, and then like their hair and like fingernails started falling out.
Oh no.
Which is like the first like obvious outcome of like selenosis, like excess selenium intake. But yeah. So just as kind of a bit of a case study in how soil levels of a particular nutrient can influence intake of that nutrient. Because like the dietary patterns of the people getting like Keshan or Kashin-Beck disease weren't like dramatically different than people who weren't getting those diseases. It's just like other people were like farming and growing rice in more selenium rich regions, and those were like super selenium poor regions. So like eat broadly the same stuff, and most of the folks in China were eating enough selenium, and folks in those particular regions were eating almost none. And also, like I mentioned in the last episode that selenium, I found it fascinating when I was looking at research on micronutrients. So this is just like a little bit of an aside. But it has like the craziest dose response curve in terms of like outcomes of high versus low selenium intake, and like the broad number of things that are influenced by selenium intake. And so like I didn't know anything about selenium until I started looking into micronutrient research. Like it's just not a nutrient like people think about hardly ever. unless they really love Brazil nuts, which are like super selenium rich. And so
nice.
you can maybe wind up with like excess selenium consumption if you eat like a shitload of Brazil nuts. Anyway, beyond that, like most people have no reason to ever think about selenium.
When I hear it, it sounds like the name for the Stan Army of Selena Gomez.
I can see
Those
that.
are the selenators, though, so a little different.
Interesting. I did not know that. But yeah, so selenium is an essential nutrient because it is incorporated into proteins called selenoproteins, which do a bunch of stuff. But in general, like most nutrients, it's thought that like the general effects of selenium on human health have like a U-shaped curve where like if you don't consume enough, bad stuff happens. If you consume too much, bad stuff happens. And then there's just kind of like an optimal intake in the middle. But for specific things that are influenced by selenium intake, you see like wildly different dose response curves. So like with selenium intake and type 2 diabetes risk, there's like almost just a linear relationship where higher selenium intakes are associated with like linearly higher rates of type 2 diabetes. But for cancer risk, because like selenoproteins are involved in like various aspects of like immunity and cell cycle regulation and whatnot. For certain cancers, there's just like a negative linear relationship between selenium intake and incidence of those cancers. But then like it's for other cancers, there are just like different dose response curves. And like, it's crazy. Like I found it fascinating, both how much like soil levels and therefore like intake levels differ and like how much just geography influences selenium intake. And then also the fact that like, I had it in my mind that for like most nutrients, there was just kind of that like inverted U-shaped relationship where like there is an amount that's good. You go above that, it like if you go too far above that, it's bad. If you go too far below it, it's bad. But with selenium, like if you conceive of like general health as a broad category, you see that same like inverted U-shaped relationship. But for like specific outcomes, you're seeing just like weird linear relationships going different ways for different outcomes.
Oh my
like,
gosh.
It's wild, man.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought that was neat, and so I wanted to share
It's
it.
a bit of a wild card.
Yeah. So yeah, talked a little bit about plants, like why nutrient concentrations differ. Either the needs of the plant to produce that nutrient vary over time or by region for various reasons, because those vitamins are serving like functional purposes for the plants. And for minerals, levels can vary mostly due to soil conditions. For animals, like animal products, the primary dynamic to keep in mind is the concept of bioaccumulation, which is just that like for certain vitamins and minerals, they just accumulate up the food chain. So they're initially produced by a plant or like a plankton or something, and they're eaten by small herbivores, which are eaten by small predators, which are eaten by larger predators, and it just percolates up the food chain like that.
Yep.
So a good example of this is like omega-3 concentrations in salmon are like close to 3 times higher in wild salmon than farmed salmon.
What?
Yeah, because like farmed salmon are just kind of fed feed, I guess. Like
that makes sense. I didn't know that though. Like I know the bad example of like mercury in fish, but I didn't know omega-3 in salmon being so much higher in wild salmon.
Yeah. Like
that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is that's another thing where I think folks, I think there might be like a little bit too much scaremongering over like farmed versus fresh, seafood products or whatever. But I mean, in the case of omega-3 content in salmon, like it is true that like fresh is considerably better.
Damn.
And the reason for that is that most of the omega-3 in the marine ecosystem is made by phytoplankton, which are then consumed by little fishies, consumed by bigger fishies, and some of those bigger fishies are salmon. And so like wild salmon are consuming omega-3s that have kind of concentrated up the food chain by the time it got to them.
Yep.
Like plankton have a little omega-3s, the little fishies that eat the plankton get the omega-3s from the plankton, so they have a little bit higher levels. The slightly larger fishies that eat those get the omega-3s from the very little fishies, and then salmon eat those slightly larger fishies. And so yeah, like
efficient
bioaccumulation. The example of mercury you gave, like you said, that is the exact same principle, but kind of negative and in reverse, where yeah, like there's like very low levels of mercury in water, but like it gets into the plankton or like the very little fishies, and then as larger and larger fish eat those smaller fish, they just get higher and higher mercury levels, because at no point along the way can any of them excrete the mercury, and so it just bioaccumulates up the food chain. And one interesting thing to note about that is like that wasn't something people needed to worry about until the mid 1800s, because like almost all of the mercury in water came from burning coal. And so like I guess there was probably like technically slightly higher levels of mercury in like tuna than like shad in 1820 or whatever, but there were still really low levels of mercury in tuna in 1820. But then once coal burning power plants started popping up all over the place, it just like raised kind of the background level of mercury in water high enough that you could get enough bioaccumulation to potentially be dangerous if you eat too much predatory fish too often, which is a bummer. But yeah, that's where it came from. Yeah, it's not just like an inherent facet of the world. It's
something we fucked up.
It's the result of the first industrial revolution and things that have followed it. Another example is like vitamin A. So this was something that on the first episode, people were just like, why didn't you mention this one fun fact I know about a particular nutrient? That probably sounded too dismissive, but no, like okay.
It's just such a specific piece of feedback that it seems like a lot of people gave.
Like close to a dozen people did. I got a lot of DMs about this one specific thing.
Is it about bear liver?
It's about bear liver.
It is a fun fact. I almost said it earlier.
I mean, that would be fine. Okay. This is a little aside, and this is just going to be me complaining for a brief second. One of the things that gets under my skin.
Oh my God.
One of the things that gets under my skin is when I'm given feedback or criticism that implies that I am uninformed or don't know something simply because I did not mention that one thing in one single piece of content.
Yes. That makes sense.
And oh my God. And if it's just like one thing in one episode of the podcast, it's cool. But when over the course of 2 weeks, I get like a dozen people being like, oh, did you not know about like bear liver and vitamin A? I'm like, shut the fuck up, all of you. Like it irks me after a while, because it's like, no, guess what? The episodes are already long. Do you want me to tell you everything I know about nutrition every time we do a nutrition episode on the podcast? No, because each episode would be slightly longer than they currently are, and no one wants that. Anyway, yeah, vitamin A bioaccumulates up the food chain. And here's a fun little fact for you folks that know the fact about bear liver.
Aggressive.
So, you have probably heard that, yeah, if you like a single bite of polar bear liver has enough vitamin A to kill someone. Like if you eat like pretty much any polar bear liver, there's a very good chance you're going to die.
Stay away from polar bears and their organs and everything.
Polar bears are spooky, man.
They are.
They hunt humans. We're in their food chain. Don't fuck with them.
Don't fuck with them.
Anyway, yes, they have toxic levels of vitamin A in their liver. But it is also generalizably true that other predators also have high levels of vitamin A in their liver, like higher than the herbivores that they might be eating, because of the same process of bioaccumulation. But polar bears and Arctic animals in particular are kind of the only ones to which the principle of like a single bite will kill you applies. Like if you had like a single bite of black bear liver, like it probably wouldn't taste good. and it if you had like a large serving, it might have enough vitamin A to fuck you up. But it also has like way lower vitamin A concentrations than polar bear livers do. Like, and so but also that same concern relates to other Arctic animals. So it's not exclusive to polar bears. Like bearded seals also have like similarly high levels of vitamin A. And so if you ate bearded seal liver, it would also kill you. And that is because, like, due to the principle of bioaccumulation, like, it's a thing that's fairly specific to the Arctic just because the bottom level of that food chain just has, like, particularly high, like, vitamin A levels. Like, the Arctic plankton that are at the very base of that food chain that start that process of bioaccumulation just have higher vitamin A levels than, like, grass does. That, you know, like would be kind of the base of a terrestrial food system. But yeah. So for people listening, I knew that fun fact. And in fact, I knew another fun fact about that fun fact.
Greg, you know so many fun facts. Everyone knows it. It's all right.
I know. I probably get too worked up about that, but it is just like the if someone says, "Hey, I wish you would have mentioned this thing," that's cool. If it's How did you not know this? Like, why are you unaware of this thing? It's like, don't make that assumption. Like, it bothers me. I'm a person too. I have feelings. Okay. Let's move on.
Okay.
Because we're just about done.
Okay.
So, micronutrient content varies considerably. There's more variability than there is than like labeling error in calories and macronutrients for like very understandable reasons. In animal products, like different amounts of stuff, like different amounts of nutrients lower in the food chain allow for different levels and amounts of bioaccumulation up a food chain. And just like the age of the animal is going to matter as well. Like how long has it had to consume stuff and for it to bioaccumulate in that animal itself. For plants, again, vitamins serve purposes in plants. Their needs for the vitamins differ over time, so their production of the vitamins differs over time. Minerals, a lot of it's about soil conditions. So yeah, there is just a lot of variability there, both over time, between different regions, et cetera, you get the point. So that is just something to be aware of if you are interested in tracking micronutrient intake. With calories and macros, you can be like reasonably confident that the number at the end of the day is probably within about 5 or 10% of your actual intake, as long as you did a pretty good job of logging. With micronutrients, you should, like, in your head, just build in a little bit more fuzz when you're looking at that number. Like if you see you had, I don't know, 700 milligrams of vitamin A or micrograms, whatever the units are, doesn't matter. Well, it matters a lot, but we'll just go with milligrams. If you see that you consumed 700 milligrams of vitamin A today, just kind of like build in maybe like 20-30% range of like fuzziness around that. Like, you know, maybe it says 700, maybe your actual consumption was 500, 550, maybe it was like 900, 1,000. Like it is, but it should at least point you in the right direction. But the amount of precision you can track with is inherently lower than it is for calories or macros. And then just the final thing to note about this is that micronutrients are a little bit difficult to track if you would just like to track micronutrients to understand how much you're consuming now and just kind of like audit intake for yourself. So government agencies and regulations don't require manufacturers to list all of the nutrients contained in the food on a food label. And they're not required to like have a secondary database or whatever that they then report to the government of like, hey, you know, I might only list 9 nutrients on the label, but we actually have this data on all of these other nutrients behind the scenes. Like they're not required to have that at all. And they don't. So, and like the fact that it's not all listed on nutrition labels makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Because like
it would be very big.
Yeah, if every essential nutrient was listed on every nutrition label, the sheer size of the list would take focus away from like higher priority nutrients that governments like do want people to actually pay attention to for public health reasons.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, in most countries, like food manufacturers are only required to report energy content, macronutrient content, sugar, saturated fat, fiber, and depending on the country, either salt or sodium. And that's it as far as things that are fairly universal. And a lot of countries then also have regulations regarding like food fortification. Like if you do add some like iron or B vitamins to the food or whatever, like the synthetic vitamins or minerals that you add to the food, like you're required to report them on the label as well. But beyond that, like there are some like country specific things. So like in the US, food manufacturers have to report iron, calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. Like food manufacturers in Europe, for instance, don't have to report those things. But yeah, there's a fairly small list of mandatory reporting requirements for nutrients. Everything beyond that is voluntary. And
if it's voluntary, they ain't doing it.
Yeah, they're absolutely not. So in the article on the Macro Factor website, I'll link to this in the show notes. There was a study looking at the frequency of nutrient reporting on UK food level or UK food labels, like what percentage of food labels reported about this nutrient. And there's just like a long list. And I'm just going to ask listeners to like look at that list and try to figure out for themselves what nutrients are mandatory on UK nutrition labels and which are voluntary.
Yeah.
And I'll just tell you, it's fucking obvious.
Yeah.
Like the reporting frequency goes from like in excess of 95% down to like, I think like 70 something percent for fiber, which is voluntary, but it's a voluntary one that a lot of people did choose to report, down to, I think the next one was maybe calcium at like 8% of food labels. Like
yeah,
it's
like
just
single digits.
Just falls off a cliff.
Yeah.
So if something is not a mandatory reporting nutrient, like just no one reports it. So if you do want to track your micronutrients, you're going to need some way to reference like government or research databases that will have like robust micronutrient intake for foods. The analog way to do this is just keep a food journal, write down everything you consume in a day, try to make note of like portion sizes, and then just like pull up the USDA database and look at each food for yourself and make note of things. Like I'm making the point that like, yes, we sell a nutrition app and you can do this much easier and quicker in the app, but you absolutely do not have to use it or any other nutrition application to do it. Like it is possible to do it kind of manually.
Of course. Sounds not fun though.
Yeah. But it is much. I don't just say this because I'm an interested party. It is just like objectively much faster and easier to do it using an app that allows you to do it. And you're going to need an app that is like hooked up to high quality research grade databases that have plenty of foods with robust micronutrient reporting. And even then, like it is still more of a hassle than just tracking macros and calories because like I said, most branded food products do not have micronutrient information. So you would need to track like common food equivalents, for instance, like, you know, if you had like a Whopper from BK, you couldn't just track a Whopper and get the micronutrients for it. Like you would need to try to find like a beef entry. It doesn't have cheese, does it? No, Whoppers don't have cheese. But like a beef entry, a bun entry, like ketchup, pickles, whatever, that pretty closely match the macronutrient and energy content of the Whopper, and will give you a pretty good approximation of, therefore, the micronutrient content of said sandwich. So yeah, like you'll need to track your food and use like common food equivalents from research grade databases instead of just being able to like scan barcodes and pretty easily log branded foods.
Right.
So it does take more effort, even if you use an app that allows you to do it and save a lot of effort over the manual approach. Like it is just still a little bit more difficult.
Yes, especially if you eat a lot of branded foods.
Yes.
If you don't eat a lot of branded foods, it's about the same amount of time. Yeah.
So yeah, just to wrap up this episode, because we have reached the end of the content I had prepared.
Okay.
Takeaways. 1, there are still a surprising number of open questions related to macronutrients. As discussed in the last episode, we're still not even like 100% sure we have a comprehensive list of all essential and conditionally essential nutrients. And as discussed in this episode, the research describing intake needs for essential nutrients is still in a lot of cases surprisingly sparse. For example, there are still a lot of nutrients that just have AIs instead of like being able to work in the DRI framework. And there are still like some methodological concerns and just like analytical concerns related to the data that does exist. So, this is, we know a lot more than we did 100 years ago, but there's still a lot of open questions, a lot more to learn, and a lot of room for just more research and methodologically better research in a lot of cases. Number 2, with the first thing being said, there is an element of just like the proof being in the pudding. Like we probably do understand micronutrient needs, not as well as we could, but probably good enough.
Yeah.
And the food supply in modern industrialized countries is like broadly sufficient for most people to be fine without ever thinking about micronutrient intake. As you mentioned at the start, Lynn's going through the history, we used to see a lot of disease that was like specifically linked and owing to micronutrient deficiencies.
Yep.
In 2023, like we just don't. At least in wealthy countries where people have access to enough food and food from diverse food sources. In like really impoverished communities that have like less access to food, less access to like diverse food choices, like there are still issues, but like by and large, it was an access question. And for most people, the access question has been solved. And so like most of the time, like people are fine and they don't need to be that concerned about micronutrient intake. And so, yeah, if you're not generally undernourished and you regularly consume foods and beverages from all major food groups, you're probably going to be okay. And yeah, I don't think that this is something that most people need to be preoccupied with or overly concerned about, unless you have specific symptoms that could be like directly attributable to a micronutrient deficiency. And you go to your doctor, they get blood work, and they say like, hey, yeah, like you have, say, like anemia because your iron's super low. Like maybe try to consume more iron. Like that still happens, but those are things that can be addressed in a medical context. And yeah, if you have concerns related to that, talk to your doctor. But again, like most people, most of the time are broadly fine. Though I will note there are some exceptions. So the first one is there are like certain diseases, conditions, or medications that can increase your micronutrient needs. But if you have any of those things, your doctor will probably tell you about it and say like, hey, supplement with this thing, you'll be fine. 2 is that people with diets that involve excluding entire food groups might need to be a little bit more concerned. So
makes sense.
All of this is in the context of consuming sufficient food from broadly diverse sources. Yeah, if you just exclude entire food groups from your diet, like there is a greater likelihood that you might have issues related to insufficient micronutrient intake. And then this is the only like really specific like kind of recommendation that I'll give related to this stuff, is that if you're listening to this and you're a darker skinned person, like if you're African American, Hispanic, like South Asian or whatever, living in the US or Northern Europe, there's a decent chance that it might not be a bad idea to get checked for like vitamin D status. So I'll link a paper related to this in the show notes. Like I mentioned in the last episode, the ability of the skin to synthesize vitamin D differs by latitude, because that influences like how direct the sunlight is and how many UV rays are reaching your skin. And like melanin content of the skin also affects that. Like it protects you from sunburn, like fewer UV rays penetrate the skin, but fewer are penetrating the skin also to stimulate vitamin D synthesis. So yeah, like the rates of like very low vitamin D levels in the blood are like 15 to 20 times higher in people living in America of African descent versus European descent. So yeah, like that is a pretty broad difference. And so yeah, if you're like black or brown listening to this, you live in the US or Europe, and you haven't had your vitamin D levels checked, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to do so.
Yeah.
And then last thing is if you'd like to audit your micronutrient intake, you'll generally need to do some food logging, since most micronutrients aren't listed on food labels. If you do that, again, you can do it manually. It's going to take you forever. You'll probably want to use an app that does have like common foods coming from research databases that are integrated and obviously labeled for you to choose those to be the ones you track. And yeah, MacroFactor does this. You should check it out. It's great. But it's not the only one that does so. So yeah, there are other options out there. Just want to make that clear. But a specific benefit of MacroFactor is I believe we are the only app that does actually clearly list the ranges of nutrients, like showing you the LTI, RDA, and UL for various nutrients, instead of just presenting everything as just like one target, or maybe like the RDA and the UL. So anyway, I think it's a great product, but I don't want to make it sound as if it is necessary to track your micronutrient intake. There are other options. So yeah, that's about it as far as content goes. But I do have just two little things related to this to end on. One is depressing and the other is kind of cool.
Okay.
Can I lead with the depressing one so that we don't end on a low note?
Yes.
Okay, so as I just mentioned, if you live in a developed country and have access to plenty of food and diverse food choices, you generally don't need to worry about micronutrient intake all that much. Like you're probably going to be fine. Or if you're consuming like a little bit less of a nutrient than you need to, it'll probably be in kind of that insufficient range rather than the deficient range. And oftentimes like insufficiencies like aren't that bad, aren't that scary. So like, whatever. Most of the time it's fine. But that is not universal worldwide. Like in lower and even some middle income countries, diseases like related to or directly the result of micronutrient deficiencies are still very common. And I think a lot of people don't fully understand like how common like deaths due to starvation and undernutrition, and not even just deaths, but just like critical lifelong health problems like related to undernutrition are still around the world. Like, so still like in 2023, around like 9 to 10 million people per year die from malnutrition. And some of that is due to like kind of starvation per se, like just less energy than one would need to survive. But a lot is due to like undernutrition from like micronutrients. So, you know, like Pellagra and like berry, they're not really things in America anymore, but like they are still things in like other parts of the world. And so like, yeah, severe micronutrient deficiencies are still like a really major global health concern. Again, like on a scale that I think a lot of people don't realize, like 9 to 10 million people a year, like that's a lot. Like what's the quote? Like one death is a tragedy, but 1,000 is a statistic. Like I think that still so many fucking people are dying of malnutrition that it is, if you hear this, it can be easy for it to, just come across as a statistic instead of like mass human tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale. But it is mass human tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale. And, I don't know, like, not to be like too fatalistic about this, but like it is a problem that is like solvable to a degree that makes me like extremely mad. Because like it's not something that like I can do anything about in a tangible way, or like any of you listening could do anything about in a tangible way. But like they're like I think the estimated cost like globally for just like completely eradicating severe malnutrition, and again like saving 9 to 10 million lives per year, which again like that's a shitload of people. The last I saw, like the estimated cost to like make that not a thing anymore is like $40 billion a year, which like that's a big number. I don't have $40 billion, but that's like, for instance, like just to pull a random comparison out of the hat, like that's like 1/20th of the United States military budget.
Yep.
So yeah, like that's fucking cool, and it pisses me off every time I think about it. But if you would like to like at least try to make a small difference in that area, there are a lot of like high quality charities that like help with food fortification and like food access in parts of the developing world where severe malnutrition is still common. One that I'll link in the show notes that you might want to check out is called GAIN, which stands for Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Like I said, there are plenty of others. Like another good one is like Iodine Global Network, which helps with like salt iodization programs, which like we don't think that much about like goiters anymore in the US, but like that used to be a big thing because like people were iodine deficient, and severe iodine deficiencies during early childhood is related to like, well, not related to, causes like impeded like mental development, which is like not rectifiable. Like it's a lifelong thing. So there are like other charities like that kind of target specific micronutrients where malnutrition is common. But GAIN is like a highly rated, like well-run charity that kind of takes a holistic approach to helping out with some of these problems. And so, yeah, like if that's something that you care deeply about, that would be a good place to send some money. So that's the depressing one. Shift gears. It's going to be hard to end on a high note after this, but other just little thing related. Oh, so this is one of, I think, the funner facts related to micronutrients. God, I'm trying to put myself in a better headspace because I don't. This okay. I've got it. I can do it. So micronutrients, and in particular vitamin D, likely played a pretty large role in the success of the Vikings, which is just, I think, a fun little historical fact. So in the last episode, we talked about vitamin D deficiencies and rickets and osteomalacia and how that causes like poor bone formation. People wind up short. And yeah, so that was like a big thing in a lot of Europe during the time that the Vikings were crushing it and doing their thing. And if you go back and read like contemporary accounts of Viking raids, people talk like these are absolute giants like raiding our village. Like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
But like they weren't. So the thing is, like, people from like Norway, Sweden, like the parts of the world where the Vikings came from, they were like about the same height during the era of the Viking raids as they are now. Like they just didn't have
Yeah.
the same growth stunting that the rest of Europe was dealing with. And that may seem somewhat counterintuitive because really high latitude, much less direct sunlight for vitamin D synthesis. But they ate a lot of fish, and they kind of took the don't let anything go to waste approach to eating fish. And so they consumed a lot of cod liver and cod liver oil. And cod liver oil is quite rich in vitamin D. And so, probably the largest reason that they were just so much larger and more physically imposing than anyone else in Europe who they were waging war against was just because they were consuming enough vitamin D.
Yeah.
And that's wild to think about because that has had pretty major ramifications in just world history. So a little one is the English language is kind of a descendant of Germanic and Romance languages, but is also, I don't know if it's totally unique, but it's fairly unique in that we don't have gendered nouns besides nouns for people or animals that are clearly of a gender, but we a table, for instance.
Right.
It's just the table. It's not Mr. or Miss Table, for instance.
Yeah.
Whereas most Germanic and Romance languages do have that. And I don't think the exclusive reason, but one of the reasons that is not the case in English is because of the Vikings. After they raided the British Isles, a lot of them also settled in the British Isles. They took British wives and they tried to learn the language. And Old English did have gendered nouns, but the Vikings learned the language pretty well, but they just didn't want to deal with that shit. So they just dropped it.
Yeah.
And I am very grateful for that because when I was trying to learn German in school, I did not like learning what is it, der Tisch for table or die Fenster for window, whatever. I don't remember most of them, and I feel that's unimportant. It's a table, it's not Mr. Table. It's fine. So that's a little thing. Another thing is as a somewhat indirect result of the success of the Viking raids, at least partially owing to their consumption of cod liver oil and vitamin D, is the progression of feudalism and the crystallization or the start of the process of state formation in Europe, where basically since the fall of the Roman Empire, with the exception of just a brief period during the Carolingian Renaissance and Charlemagne, his sons, whatever, there weren't really states in Europe. There were just little principalities and little hamlets and whatnot. And there weren't what we would think of as nation states. And there also certainly weren't what we would think of as modern nations by the end of the period of Viking raids. But there was a bit of feudal order at the start of the Viking related period. And one of the issues that people had was individual coastal lords couldn't marshal enough forces to successfully repel Viking raids. So it led to the need for more cooperation and centralization of authority to be able to start being able to more efficiently coordinate responses to Viking raids. And that was one of the first steps down the path to the development of what we think of now as European nation states. And if the Vikings weren't eating the vitamin D and they were smaller and punier and couldn't raid as successfully, who knows what Europe and by extension, because Europe, for better or worse, I think in a lot of cases for worse, played a pretty large role in shaping world history, starting a couple years after that with exploration and the slave trade and colonization and all of that. So who knows if or how or when any of that would have happened were it not for the Vikings consuming vitamin D. And like I'm not trying to create like a grand theory of history where that was just like the one causal factor, but you know, the way that just like a small thing can like at least have like a partial influence on ultimately like large cascading effects subsequent. Like, I just think it's kind of neat to think about. But at the end of the day, the Vikings, not all that big and scary by modern standards, but by the standards of their day, big and scary because of the vitamin D. Cool thing to end on. That's all I got.
Yeah. What
All
are we
right.
going to talk about next episode?
We're going to talk more about micronutrients. It
Right.
will be the third part and final part in the series, where we'll talk a little bit more about, like, if you do want to, like, track and monitor your micronutrient intake, like, which ones might you want to pay a little bit closer attention to? Because, like, the risk of like insufficient intake or like rates of insufficient intake do differ like pretty dramatically, where some things like basically no one's consuming insufficient amounts, like sodium, for instance. Unless you're trying to consume a low sodium diet, like you're probably fine. Like you're consuming enough, maybe too much, who knows. But then like for other nutrients, like deficiencies are rare, but like insufficient intake, eating a little bit less than like maybe you could or should, is considerably more common. So like we'll talk about that a little bit. And we'll talk a little bit about why you should, if you pay attention to micronutrients, you shouldn't be like too tunnel visioned about it and think about them excessively kind of outside of the context of like the overall food matrix and just like other beneficial things about food that aren't just purely down to like quantifiable micronutrient intake. And also I want a chance to take questions, because I'm sure by the end of the series, people probably have some questions about micronutrients. And so I think those first two things I mentioned, I don't think they'll take that long to get through. Hopefully, we'll see. I mean, we thought this would be a shorter episode, but I would like to have time to answer listener questions. So that's probably what we have on deck for next time.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right. Thanks for listening. As mentioned at the top of the show, we will be back to chat with you more in 3 weeks instead of 2. Hope they go great. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.